Engas trace their tribal founders to non-human mythical founders like snakes, bats, hawks. And in Enga, there are no stylistic, moral, or religious or linguistic markers between tribes, which is common in the world, within Enga dialect groups. But there are some difference between dialect groups. Why identity? What's important about identity? People always say, oh, identity is everything. Because it makes people feel that they are secured by the group that they identify with, and thus willing to make sacrifices for the group. So when you begin to have identity, tribal identity, it builds society out of what otherwise would have been a collection of self-interested individuals. And one old man said, all people are like the root and trunk of a tree that has many branches. They stretch out in different directions, but they all grew from one root and trunk. So after the identity, then there are usually genealogies here that link the tribal founder to all the members below. And the Enga can trace their family trees back 14 generations often. And a very interesting fact is that history matters in all human societies. And this may come from our tribal organization earlier on. Almost every society is fascinated by history, and that's unique for our species. So, tribal identity in the life cycle. During childhood, humans are cooperative breeders. That means that people of all ages take care and help raise the children and community. And then from the age 3 on, children spend most of the day in mixed age play groups, giving and receiving care. And so the bonds and affiliations are established. So really, emotions of tribal loyalty are born in childhood with these positive interactions. So it's a centripetal force, okay? And then in adolescence, rites of passage bond cohorts of young men, and these are nearly universal in tribal societies. These are young men, young Enga men. You can see how young and tender they are and terrified, and they're going into the initiation to be turned into men. And they're instilled with morals, respect of elders, discipline, obedience, hard work, responsibility, group loyalty, and trust, big one. There's no emphasis on warfare in these initiations. The outcome, you can see, the transformation. They believe that these men are married to a spirit woman who can transform them into strong, healthy men. And if they go astray and have relations with human women, she will sanction them, and they will not be transformed. So that's a way of keeping them in line. But you can see the difference here. So, you know, initiations appear to be deep in our evolutionary history. You have indications of it at Lascaux, Chauvet, and many of the cave paintings. Then in midlife, clan membership or tribe membership gives access to land and assistance in many activities: gardening, tree felling, house construction, bridge building, all of these things. Clan or tribal membership is people feel obliged to help their fellow members. And then they have big wealth distributions, and in New Guinea people are famous for giving away many pigs, and the top picture is this distribution of pearl shells, and the bottom picture is a distribution of pigs. And this wealth is circulated for bride wealth, for child growth payments, compensation for injury, competitive exchanges, funeral feasts, peacemaking. And again, the whole clan or tribe comes together. Communication with the ancestors is essential. There are regular rituals to reaffirm identity, history, loyalty through rituals for the ancestors that bring people from all over and involve extensive feasting and eating together. Now here's something that's not normally discussed, but it's very important, is norm enforcement, because how does one enforce norms while preserving clan unity? People are punished. It alienates, damages reputation, generates grudges and revenge. So in many tribes, they have forms of restorative justice in which compensation makes up for damage done and heals community and brings the offender back into the fold, because they really cannot afford to alienate, active young men or women who are potentially productive. The extreme deviants have to be dealt with the family, by the family. Often they're hamstrung, so they can't run around and make trouble. And Enga in New Guinea now has legal plurality with customary courts that solve 90% of the disputes. And when a man has to pay or a woman has to pay compensation, everyone comes together to help, to pay the amount for reasons of kinship, peace. They value the person, to show their leadership or personal reasons. We have 1,000 cases now of restorative justice that we've recorded. And this is just one example. In 2016, one clan member committed a grisly murder, and there were 25 contributors who came and gave about $6,000 and 27 pigs. So this gives you an idea of what security clan membership provides. If he kept doing this, then people wouldn't help him anymore. And then, of course, there's warfare. Warfare is very important also. And warfare goes up and down. Enga say our land is green and black. Green when there's no warfare, and black when we're fighting. And, there are long periods without, and then fights come up again. It's a clan responsibility. It activates very, very strong, emotionally charged bonds of brotherhood. The Enga Wars were largely between neighbors to reestablish balance of power. And it's so interesting that this can occur between neighbors, people you know, people you marry, people you go to church with or school with. And I thoroughly documented one war before the high-powered weapons were introduced. It's not possible anymore. But the night before, they have rallies to turn the neighbors of another tribe into enemies overnight. And they sing songs like, your girls are not like our girls. Their skin were like crocodile skins, have Danus thorns embedded in them. Our boys are afraid to touch the skins of your sisters or daughter. You yourself can pay bride wealth to marry your own girls, implying incest. Or you are descendants of a black-butted python. Return to your houses in the mountains and look for the excreta of rats, pigs, and marsupials to eat. They sing and they dance and they do this and they taunt the whole night. And the next day, they're able to go out and fight and even kill people who they know quite well. And then you have peacemaking, which is also a clan enterprise. So usually after 2 or 4 deaths in the past, peace was called, war reparations were paid for death and destruction, all families contributed, and food sharing with the neighboring clan with whom they were fighting rehumanizes the enemy, it reopens marriage, and then the balance of power and exchange ties are renewed. And you can see in the picture here of the man with the pork, the enthusiasm with which people are giving as a group to restore ties. So humans have 2 social strategies. One are corporate group strategies. Clans, tribes cooperate as a united group, what I've described up to now. But they also have network strategies in which individuals form networks of mutual support with others outside the group, usually through marriage ties. And it opens boundaries, creates strong ties of social support, and is the basis for vast networks of exchange. And the Enga had networks of exchange involving 250 clans or tribes and 40,000 people. And the wealth would move from one to the other. But the best evidence against pure xenophobia and closed boundaries is multilingualism. In Oceania, Africa, South America, most people in tribal groupings can speak 2 to 4 languages. In some countries, they speak 5 to 9 because the mothers can speak one and the grandmothers another, and because they're trading with people. So these tribes are not closed. Interactions with others is very important. Now I'll just talk for a minute. There's no timer here, so I don't know where I am, but on transforming tribalism. With increasing social complexity, old tribes break down and new tribes or ethnicity are formed out of the exercise of power. In our country, we can see, for instance, American Indians before, of course, were many, hundreds of many little groups. And when they built the National Museum in DC, this was uniting them into one group so they could exercise power. The same thing went on, of course, with the switch from Negroes from many, many African countries to blacks. And so new tribes, okay, 56, okay, I gotta move. It just came on. Okay, so religious dominant, missions abolish, in Enga, where I work, missions have abolished many tribal traditions, and so new tribes develop. Some of them are religious dominations. They're peaceful but competitive. They're united by church activities, schools, and health facilities. Another form of tribes are the youth versus the elders. With the introduction of firearm, teams of mercenaries and young fighters have taken control because the elders no longer have control, and they fight for payment, for their own interest, and death and destruction have soared. And one old peacemaker said that they came up to him with a gun and said, "Old man, your time has come and gone." Okay, then we have political tribes forming, like in this country. The winner takes it all. He gives most of his benefits to supporters. And here, when you begin to have broader politics, moral issues enter as texting and Facebook are used to promote or demote candidates. With modern technology, candidates are no longer vetted by face-to-face communication, and fake news is flourishing. And you can see the energy in this. I'm almost done here, and so, okay. You have 3 months of ecstatic campaigning, and votes are purchased. There's strong tribal or political loyalties with no element of social security, frequent violence, new factions in society. So in summary, tribes are based on evolved psychological dispositions and cultural constructions. That's the first point I wanted to make. I'm running out of time. And the second is that in small-scale societies, tribes cover needs from birth to death. Sentiments of tribal unity begin in childhood and are constantly reinforced through ceremony, defense, festivals. Individuals have broad networks outside the tribe. Hostility can be activated and deactivated overnight. And with technology, in-group dispositions are expanded to fashion, as in our country, large pseudo-tribes tied to moral values and the exercise of power. Tribalism, it's not driven by instincts out of the past, culture's in the driver's seat, and can leverage sentiments for better or for worse. Thank you. Okay. Yeah. So let's see.
Yes. Okay. So I am Allison Brooks, and I am a professor at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and I'm also part of the Human Origins program at the Smithsonian. And I'm going to talk about when do we see the beginning of what we could call some of these tribal organizations, of large-scale human organizations that operate for better or for worse against other large-scale organizations. And I think that we've begun to explore this. This is a picture. Just a little bit about where I'm coming from. I'm an archaeologist, but I've also worked both with Dr. Wiessner, who just spoke, and with my husband and a large team of other people in the Kalahari with the Jinkwasi, hunter-gatherers when we came. And they have a very different organization, not a tribe, as we would call it. Then I've worked in about 7 other African countries doing archaeology among tribal people, non-tribal people, hunter-gatherers, and so on. So I'm a little bit of a social anthropologist and a little bit looking at what we can say about the past from the very minimal remains we find in these sites. So as Polly has explained to us, we ask a question, what is a tribe? Anthropologists originally defined tribes as a level of human organization beyond the face-to-face group or the kin-based clan, which can be a subset of a tribe, but they're often less extensive, complex, or multi-ethnic than nations. Most nations involved or subsumed several tribes. Think of Italy or Gaul as divided into 3 parts or whatever, that many of our modern nations were once collections of tribes who spoke different languages and had different customs. A tribe is one of the many imagined communities. That is, in many cases, it exists in our heads, and as much as it has a reality on the ground, and that sense of who is a tribe and how far the tribe extends is reified by symbols. Those symbols can be what you wear, it can be how you speak and what kind of accent. Even if you speak the same ostensible language, it can be the accent that you use to speak it. It can be your gestures, your body ornaments, your body modifications, whether you knock your front teeth out or wear tattoos or whatever. The ritual practices that bind adolescents together in initiation, the burial practices, the shared origin stories, and the shared speech, and so forth. Tribes are potential platforms for corporate action, including warfare, raiding, territorial expansion, adoption of new technologies like farming or fishing, and practices. The membership of tribes is interesting. It's according to kinship and descent rules, and whether you've been through the ceremonial rite of passage. But the descent rules often prioritize one gender over another. So that in Botswana, where I worked for many years, it is said by the dominant Swana majority that women have no tribe, because women marry out of the tribe into either other groups of the same tribe or often other tribes. So women have a less strong attachment to the tribe that they grew up in than men do. And leadership can be hereditary in a tribe or charismatic. The best warrior wins. It can be democratic or autocratic. It can be individual or corporate. And when I worked among the Jinkwasi in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s, was it a tribe? And Polly and I agreed that it wasn't a tribe because the living groups were very small, but they all had large individual networks. The relationships of people to each other were individual. They weren't corporate. The minimal group of people who lived together throughout the year was 25, usually a few adults and maybe 6 to 10 children. But when the weather dried up and there were very few water points, about 120 people might live together for a few months. The thing was, though, that every year, if you took a census of the people living around the waterhole, 50% of them were different. And what was the main fundamental organization tying people together across space were these networks of partners. Some of them were kin partners, some of them were marriage partners, some of them were just exchange partners. You wanted to have as many partners as possible, so when the weather went bad where you are, you had an excuse to go move in with somebody else. And obviously that's not going to work if everybody goes and moves in with the same person. Then that person pretty soon has nothing to eat. But it would allow people to redistribute themselves across the landscape in a bad year. So these networks were your capital against bad times. And this work on networks was Polly's work who just spoke to us about Enga, was fundamental in establishing how important these were. What I was always interested in her study is the size of your network grew into middle age. Because then in your middle age, you're the sandwich generation. You're supporting your parents, you're supporting your kids, and you need a big network if anything goes bad. But then when you get old, you start pruning your network. It isn't worth putting that kind of effort into exchanging gifts with all those people, keeping up with all those people. It's like pruning your Christmas card list. And the leadership of such a flexible society was largely situational. And it was based on consensus. Women had pretty much an equivalent voice to men, and there were some situations where there was warfare under a leader, but they were very rare. And we have to ask, are we, despite the fact that many of the hunter-gatherer societies we study are not organized like tribes, are we nevertheless inherently able to do this? Are we inherently hypersocial and tribal? And if so, when did it begin? So as putting on my archaeology hat, what do we look for in the record of the past to tell us that some kind of larger scale human society is forming? We look for an ability to transcend the local. And the clearest evidence of this is when we see long-range intergroup contacts, where people are clearly moving across the landscape in greater distances than we see in a typical home range of a band society. And this contact is represented in archaeology by the movement of raw material from distant sources. So these imply the existence of networks. We also look for the existence of symbols, whether those symbols are on the landscape, in caves, or in utilitarian objects that are similar across space, or personal ornaments, what kind of beads you wear. I tell my students that the university I work at is on the same street as the World Bank. So I tell my students, well, can you tell when you get up in the morning and go to class who's a banker and who's a professor? And you certainly can, because the bankers are not dressed like the professors, most of them anyway. But the use of dress, personal ornaments, pigments to signal identity and status are very common in enabling people to recognize each other across space as a friend. And these are communities linked by common symbols and technological practices. So they might all make the same kind of arrowhead, or they might all make the same kind of house. And this implies some kind of cultural transmission across space. So that's what we're looking at. We're looking at evidence of long-distance movement of people reflected in their material culture. So when do we begin to see this? Well, we do have already symbolic behavior and social intensification 90 to 60,000 years ago across large areas of Africa, from South Africa and Namibia in the south to East Africa and Tanzania and Ethiopia to Morocco and Algeria in the north. And these imply that humans had fully human social formations and very likely fully human language. The context is an archaeological stage we call the Middle Stone Age, and we see things like this little piece of decorated ochre in the upper left, the beads on the right, which are all made of the same genus of shell that lives in an estuary on the South African coast, and all of those shells have stringware in them that enables you to tell how they were worn. And they also have red ochre from rubbing against the body of somebody who was wearing a lot of ochre. Then the things at the bottom are bits of ostrich eggshell canteens, which have 15 or 16 different kinds of decorative motifs on them. And similar canteens in the Kalahari, like the one in the middle, denote regional identity, regional kinds of symbols of who made them. When do we begin to see the transport of exotic stone and shell in the Middle Stone Age? Do we see it earlier? At 77 to 80,000 years, a rock called Silkrete was transported 150 kilometers across the Kalahari. At Aduma, Ethiopia, where we worked with Dr. Tim White in the 1990s, many of the points and other tools are made from obsidian. At least 8 sources of obsidian were identified chemically, and none of them are in the local area. That's about 90,000 years ago. Then in Algeria, those shell beads I just showed you from South Africa, exactly the same shell genus shows up in Algeria at 82,000 years ago, at least 40 kilometers inland. Those shells don't grow 40 kilometers inland, they grow on the coast. So not only is it long-distance transport, it's also long-distance transport of a symbol of a personal ornament. And we also have the same shell beads in Israel at 105,000. At 200,000, in a site in central Kenya, 43% of the artifacts are made of obsidian, a especially sharp, glassy stone that sometimes is used in surgery in the United States because it's so sharp, it's sharper than steel, and it can cut between cells. You heal much faster from a surgical operation with an obsidian blade than you might with a steel scalpel. But it's a very valuable stone because of the sharpness of the edge, and 43% of the artifacts at this site in central Kenya at 200,000 years ago were from 166 kilometers away, which is long-distance transport by any definition. Okay, the fossils associated with the Middle Stone Age are all Homo sapiens, from South Africa, from Ethiopia, this one published by Haile Selassie, Johannes, and Tim White on the right. But Homo sapiens in the Middle Stone Age are even older. There's a modern human fossil in Greece now at 210,000 that was just published. There are, a year ago, new fossils, artifacts, and dates were published from Morocco, Homo sapiens, Middle Stone Age. And then what we also find is that when modern humans show up in Europe and start making cave paintings and so forth, we also have those very similar paintings in Namibia and in Indonesia. So it seems to have been an ability to represent our culture and our identity in symbols and images of things that are often mythical, like a person with a lion head, that this is fundamental to us. So this is from a paper that I wrote with Sally McBurty in the early 2000s. And this is what we thought about what Middle Stone Age people could do and the timeline along the bottom. But what we see is that many of these activities, like long-distance exchange in the last 10 years, have been extended much further back in time. Also that Homo sapiens, we thought the oldest one was maybe 260,000 years, a few years ago. But now we know that the long-distance exchange, the beads, the points, the pigment processing of ochre and other pigments goes way back beyond 300,000, as does Homo sapiens, the most recent fossil of Jebel Irhoud on the right. Okay, so I'd like to talk very briefly about new Middle Stone Age at Olorgesailie in Kenya, where John, my husband, and I have been working with Rick Potts of the Smithsonian and a whole host of collaborators for about the last 18 years. And here we're particularly interested in sites that are around 320 to 220,000 years old. So they're older than anything else I've talked about already. So we've excavated this series of sites, and what we find is many of them have some obsidian. One of them has a tremendous amount of obsidian. And this is one of the oldest ones at 320,000. So all of this is just a screenshot of the site with a horse tooth in the middle and a bunch of obsidian flakes all around. And 42% of the plotted artifacts, there are 5,700 plotted artifacts, but we also have 45,000 small flakes of obsidian. All of this obsidian is non-local. There is no obsidian in the immediate area. And they're also making the artifacts on site. Here's a core, and here's a little point that came off the core. So we know that and all those little chips, we know that they're making they're bringing the obsidian in, and they're transforming it into artifacts there. Where did they get the obsidian from? It's not from the local area. So we, working with Stanley Ambrose, the University of Illinois, he surveyed a lot of different sources in the area, and we characterized them chemically with multiple techniques, and discovered, that I think I lost a slide in here, but there is a map. The question is, what do we mean by local? And these are maps that John Yellen and Richard Lee and others drew of where people in a hunting-gathering band move in a year. And the diameter of most of those little irregular circles is not over 30 kilometers. So anybody who's regularly moving more than 30 kilometers in this environment is probably going into somebody else's territory. Here's our map of obsidian sources. We were very fortunate to find out from all the people doing environmental work on our project and on the sites we were digging that actually the closest analog to what these sites looked like 320,000 years ago is quite by accident the northern Kalahari. Same animals, same trees, same bushes. And so we don't feel we're stretching a point when we look at the home range size in the Kalahari and the home range size here. So there's a scale at the bottom of 40 kilometers, and you'll notice that some of these sites are within 30, some of them are 40, some of them are 70, some of them are 105 kilometers away. These are not local trips. And each level of the sites that we dug have multiple different sources being accessed. So people are really moving very far over the landscape. So how do you maintain a large social network and allow strangers to interact? What we also found in the same time range in other sites is in the same area is pigment that had been worked. This is some of the earliest worked pigment in the world, and this goes along with a new emphasis on exotic raw materials. This is a semi-perforated block of ochre. We also had manganese nodules at another site, and this ochre had been semi-perforated and also ground. So here's a picture of the grinding striations, and we thought the holes might be natural, but when we looked at them under the kind of microscope that has a deep depth of field, we found that somebody had actually chopped out the holes with a straight-edged object. So these are not holes that just happened. They are holes that were deliberately made to get a powder out that could be then applied to the body or something to indicate identity. So the last question I'd like to turn to is an argument that's made by some anthropologists that once you have large-scale social formations like tribes or clans, it leads inevitably to larger-scale collaborative action, and particularly larger-scale violent action such as warfare. First of all, I should say that personal aggression is very ancient in humans. There are fossils in the past with dents in their heads from being hit. There's a fossil I'll show you in a minute that has a knife wound in his back. And there's no evidence that that's mass aggression. When hunter-gatherers fight, the fighting tends to be resolved, even if it involves more than one person, by the protagonists in the fight splitting up and moving away at least for a time. That obviously only works if you have somewhere to go. And fossil humans, as I mentioned, bear evidence of blunt force trauma and also cannibalism. So here's a Neanderthal from Iraqi Kurdistan, interestingly, who had a knife wound. That's his left side rib there with a very clear wound from a stone knife that probably didn't heal very well, and he probably died of. There's no sign of very, very extensive healing in that cut. That's like, being stabbed on the left side is going to kind of do you in. But then when we get to 18,000 to 10,000 years ago, so we have this dribble of individual aggressions throughout human history, get to 18 to 10,000 years ago, this is a period of dramatic climate fluctuation at the end of the Pleistocene. We have environments that have filled up in the interim to the carrying capacity of the environment, and then suddenly it's the last big period of global warming. The oceans rise, they drown land that people depended on. The deserts, some of them expand, but in any case, there are too many people in those arid areas to be sustained when the climate is fluctuating. And so we find burials with obvious signs of trauma. So this individual from Egypt, not only did he have a healed parifracture on his right ulna. Parifracture is when you put up your arm to prevent somebody hitting you, and they hit you anyway and break your arm. The left arm had a stone chip in his humerus, and his abdominal cavity had 2 stone bladelets in it. So probably this individual was murdered or killed. But then when we turn to the Sudan, that's 18,000, turn to the Sudan at 10,000 years ago, which is a dry area that's particularly susceptible to these things. 40%, this is a cemetery with several dozen individuals, 40% of them died of violent death. So all the pencils in the picture of the people in the lower right point to arrowheads in their bodies, and about half of these individuals are women. This is not warfare that's taking place between men. This is kill all the people warfare. Nataruk in Kenya was published last year. This is a massacre site in Kenya about 10,000 years ago around Lake Turkana. 27 individuals. Again, 8 of them are male, 8 of them are female, 5 of them are so bashed up you can't tell, and 6 of them were children. All but 2 of these individuals have evidence of some kind of trauma before they died. This individual has a stone point embedded in his head, and many others have arrow points, often in the body cavities. So this is another site besides Jebel Sahaba where a lot of people seem to have died at more or less the same time and from a violent end. But then when my colleague Susan Pfeiffer has been studying the remains of individuals on the south coast of South Africa for many years, and what's really shocking is the amount of violence against children. All of these are children's skulls and that have been perforated by somebody with a spear or a digging stick or something, and there's no healing on the edges of all these wounds. Here's another individual who's been stabbed in the head, a child, and again, that head wound has not healed in the slightest. This individual certainly did not survive. So you have to ask, at what point is this warfare in the sense of marauding armies against each other, or just a group of people who have to wipe out the other guys in order to survive? Here's another individual who had arrows in his, 2 arrows, as you can see, in the back of his, in the middle of the thoracic vertebrae. So again, another violent death. There are lots and lots of these skeletons with violent deaths. So my conclusions are that network organization over long distances and the use of pigment in the Middle Stone Age implies that recognizably human societies are more than 300,000 years old. And this ability to use symbols to cross lines is part of our DNA. It is roughly coincides with the earliest dates for our species there and elsewhere. So all humans have the potential to develop more formal tribes, but only some do so. But the ability to form large interacting social groups does not necessarily lead to warfare, nor is warfare limited to societies with capital, like farmers or herders or fishing settlements. but warfare is especially common worldwide when climate change imposes resource stress. Whether it's drought, whether it's mini ice ages, or global warming, such as we are facing in our future. So this is a cautionary tale to think about the most vulnerable parts of the world where the population has been rising for many tens of years. The world population has tripled in my lifetime. And we have to recognize that global warming is not just about losing the coastal cities. It's about something more serious. Okay, so I'd like to thank all of the people that we've worked with over many, many years to begin to develop this picture. So thank you very much for your attention. And,
well, now something completely different. My name is Richard Wrangham. I'm from Harvard University, and I study chimpanzee society. And that makes me fascinated by differences and similarities between chimpanzee society and human society. And what I want to do this evening is think about this in three different ways. I want to think about the special ways in which humans are different from chimpanzees and other primates in terms of our tribalistic tendencies. I want to think about how to understand that as an evolutionary package, where it came from, and why that particular package evolved. And I'm going to be thinking in terms of the species as a whole. You know, we just heard these wonderful examples of how tribalistic psychology plays itself out in different ways in different groups, in the Mayenga, in Botswana. Here I'm thinking more about the species as a whole. And if I have a curious picture in this first slide of some village stocks, it is to emphasize something that Polly talked about, which is the importance of adherence to social norms and the punishment that goes with it if you fail to adhere to the social norms. So I take tribalism in the form of a combination of in-group affiliation and out-group hostility to be a human universal. It's expressed in different ways. It's shaped by culture, very importantly. And something very similar happens in primates. It's very striking in chimpanzees. You certainly have strong in-group affiliation, particularly among the males. You have certainly intense out-group hostility. In the case of chimpanzees, dramatically, it can lead to deaths, where there are deliberate efforts by chimps to go off to the border and hunt and kill strangers. So it seems to me that it's pretty clear that there are deep evolutionary roots to tribalism. We see something similar in monkeys. So they stay in stable troops and attack members of neighboring groups. And in some, we have killing like in chimps. But the thing about humans is that I think that we can point to ways in which the tendencies for tribalism are kind of exaggerated in some ways. And that is because we have this extraordinary, intense increase in the amount of tolerance and cooperation that we show within groups. So what I first of all want to do is to draw attention to three ways in which this is manifest. You could certainly go to others as well, but I want to focus on these because I think they help tell the evolutionary story in a tidy way. The first thing is little aggression. So if you read the newspapers, you might be thinking, oh, well, there's lots of knife stabbings or gun shootings or whatever it is. But if you take a chimp perspective, or actually most animal perspective, there's incredibly little in our society. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking about states where large groups of strangers can come together and crush up against each other without getting into a fight. Or you can go to small-scale societies like hunters and gatherers, like these Ache from Paraguay, who Hill and Hurtado, who worked with them, have this quote, that in 17 years they never observed a scuffle between Ache men. And actually nowadays they've gone on much longer, and 43 years. If we compare, just by totting up the frequency of fighting in human societies and in chimpanzee societies, the estimates that we have at the moment, when we compare with the most aggressive of human societies, which are somewhat disordered ex-hunter-gatherers now suffering from alcohol, Nevertheless, people are fighting at something like 1,000th of the rate of chimpanzees. It's an enormous difference. Congratulations, everybody. We are nice. And further congratulations, I think, because we do not have alpha males who achieve their position by fighting, personally fighting every other male to be able to become the top guy. So in primates, that happens. If you want to be an alpha male chimpanzee, you have to get out there and personally, physically defeat every other chimpanzee in the group. That doesn't happen in humans. On the one hand, you have in small-scale societies an egalitarian set of relationships among the adult males, and there is no alpha. You know, we are all captains, they say. And then, of course, we come to modern society, where you may be thinking that there are alphas, but happily, they are not alphas that are achieving their place by personally, physically fighting everybody else. It's all done through coalitions. And I'll draw attention to the fact that this seems a really important feature of humans. And then the third point I want to make is about social conformity. We have emotions that push us in the direction of tending to agree with groups. There's this fascinating example of group polarization, where people have done experiments with 3,000 people in a sort of jury setting. And what you see is this characteristic shift of opinions to a more extreme group consensus. So the way the study is done is that you bring in your jurors and you ask them individually before they go into group discussions, what do you think of this case? And suppose they're asked to assess the guilt, and suppose you find that there are some groups in which the median of the scores is higher than the average. Okay, but by the time you get to the group consensus, it's a lot higher than the average. They all push each other in that direction. On the other hand, if they start out under the average, then they go even further under the average. So that's group polarization, one of many kinds of effects like this. You have moralistic aggression, where if somebody is not following the social norm, then, well, you can put them in the stocks, but you can talk to them and say, here's a white feather, you know, we think you ought to be joining the army in the First World War. And then overall, a perception on the way in which moral attitudes to behavior emerge is summarized here by Jonathan Haidt, saying a lot of it is to avoid conflict. The first rule of life in a dense web of gossip is be careful what you do. You'd better be able to frame your actions in a positive light. This is pushing people towards doing the things that other people approve of. Now, I want to ask where these tendencies come from. The little aggression, the no fighting alpha males, and the social conformity. And I'm going to suggest, now beginning the second part of my three-part talk, that biological self-domestication is the answer to what makes us such a peculiar, unaggressive species in the ways I've been talking about. And I'm going to suggest that it happened around the time that Alison was talking about, when she sees evidence for a change in society based on the archaeological record. In order to think about this, I want to divide the way in which we think about aggression into two. First of all, there is proactive aggression. You don't have to be emotionally involved to be proactively aggressive. You can just sit there quietly contemplating what you would like to do to X who has offended you in the past. And then you go out and you do it. So you don't have to have any kind of high arousal, but you do have to have a specific goal and a consistent target. Animals do this, humans do it. It's one kind of aggression that is supported in one particular kind of biological way in the brain. Another kind is reactive aggression, when you lose your temper. This is what happens when a man comes back and finds his wife in bed with another man. This is what happens when somebody calls your mother a rude name after you've been drinking in the bar. You are highly aroused, and you want to go for that guy and do something to him. And by the way, if other people try and get in your way, you're going to thrash out and get at them as well. So reactive aggression is what I'm going to be talking about, because we have wonderful experiments in which people have tried to take a wild animal, succeeded in taking a wild animal, and then chosen among the wild animal progeny those individuals that are particularly reduced in reactive aggression. So the way you do this, if you're thinking about doing it, is you take your young foxes or your young mink or whatever it is, and you walk towards them when they're babies, and then you write down the distance at which they say, "Ah!" And the ones that let you get closest are the ones that you breed from. And those are the ones that have less reactive aggression. Well, the amazing thing of these experiments, as many of you I'm sure have come across, is that when they were done, starting in the 1950s in Russia by Dmitry Belyaev and his colleagues, they found that within just a few years, not only did they get animals that were greatly reduced in reactive aggression, that's fine, that's expected, but they also got things like white patches on their bodies and floppy ears. In other words, these odd additions to the selective effects against reactive aggression. So what this boils down to is that if you do that experiment with animals, you find that there are two ways that you get changes, biological changes over the generations. First of all, you get them in the way that you're looking for, the reduction in aggressiveness and fear and stress. And the second one is this weird combination of all sorts of other things going on. So the white patches and floppy ears if you happen to be a species that has long ears and colored fur. And then there are these other ones as well. And I want you to pay particular attention to the ones at the bottom, the reduction in body mass, face and teeth size, sex differences, and brain size. Because lo and behold, some years ago, the archaeologist Helen Leach drew attention to the fact that these are the ways in which you recognize a domesticated animal as being distinct from a wild animal in the fossil record, and they are also characteristic of humans. In the human case, we have undergone brain reduction only relatively recently, but the other things have happened much earlier. It suggests that the relationship between a wolf and a dog is similar to the relationship between a pre-sapiens ancestor and Homo sapiens. You see the first signs of this in about 315,000 years ago in the specimens that Alison referred to from Jebel el-Hood in Morocco. You see them in several ways, reduced brow ridges and shorter face and smaller teeth. And you can take some of these characteristics of early humans at that time and see them changing as we become closer to the present. So look at the facial width here. We get an increasingly loss of wide faces. Now, hold on to your hats, you guys who've got wide faces in the audience, because I want to just focus on this, because it turns out that there is a correlation, which is extraordinarily systematic, between facial width and the degree of aggressiveness. And there's a picture of hockey players up here, because it's a wonderful way of assessing this, because the referee is not going to be paying attention to the breadth of your face. There's no possibility of bias here. But it turns out, as these graphs show for 6 professional hockey teams, that there is a tendency for men who have slightly wider faces to spend more minutes in the penalty box for fighting. And it's true in college hockey teams too. Now, I like these graphs because they make a point that there is a little trend, but nevertheless, the trend is not very predictive. So that's why those of us who have relatively wide faces need not be accused of necessarily being aggressive. There's lots of variation, as you see here. But nevertheless, there is a trend, and the trend is astonishingly consistent. Lots of people are doing these studies now. And you see here a whole list of ways in which the wide-faced men, the relatively wide-faced men, are more aggressive or antisocial, and, oops, well, less attractive in some ways, I'm sure. Let's not get carried away here. And note that there are primates, too, in which this has been shown. So there's an astonishing relationship, a predictive relationship, that as the face becomes narrower, so you can expect to have, on the whole, less aggressiveness. The bottom line of such studies, I think, indicates this, that human aggression is like that of a domesticated animal, extraordinarily suppressed in terms of reactive aggression. And human anatomy is like that of a domesticated animal. And so I want to make the case that humans actually are a domesticated animal. And then the question is, well, what do you mean by that, and how did that happen? So let's focus on the 3 things that I drew attention to. The reduction of reactive aggression, the lack of alpha male fighters, and the social conformity. And I want to draw attention in this third part of the talk about thinking about how we could have become domesticated to a feature that I think is absolutely critical in a rather chilling way, and that is, I'm calling it selective coalitionary proactive aggression. It's a mouthful. What it means is that people can get together and decide in advance to kill somebody. So that might be through execution, it might be through assassination, it might be through a lynching. We've got the death of Caesar on the left here and the death of the unfortunate Jordanian pilot from ISIS on the right. And just to take this apart, if we think about this characteristic, and the important thing about it is that humans do it, but no other species does, is that the proactive aggression, it's premeditated. The killing is initiated only if everyone decides we can do this without any risk to ourselves. The people who carried out all the murders at Auschwitz, they didn't get fought back against. They arranged it that way. So it's very low cost for the killers. And it's selective because the victims are selected in advance. And the only way you can do that, the only way that you can say to your pal, you know, that guy, Fred, I hope there are not too many Freds in the audience, he's been behaving so aggressively. Don't you think it's time we did something about it? You have to be able to talk to be able to get an idea like that. So chimps can have coalitionary proactive aggression. They go off and kill members of neighboring groups, but they don't target in advance some member of their group. Now, we've heard a little bit from Polly and Alison about hunters-gatherers being, on the whole, very peaceful. And that is absolutely right. And of course, we've had, I think, 300,000 years of selection in favor of reduced reactive aggression. But even now, if you survey the literature on hunters and gatherers, you will sometimes find that there are men who violate the social norms and who refuse to obey the ordinary exhortations of good behavior. They try and take another man's wife by force. They try and take someone's food by force. And if someone resists, then that might lead to this guy, this bad guy, maybe attacking, maybe killing somebody who gets into a conflict with him. And eventually, the society has a problem to deal with. And they'll start cajoling them, and they may ridicule them. They may sing songs of derision in their face. They may try and ostracize them, shun them completely. They may even just pack up their bags and walk away in the middle of the night. But they're hunters and gatherers, so the guy knows how to find them. And in the end, what has to happen is execution, which is known worldwide in every continent in which hunter-gatherers occur. And it's organized in a good way. So Christopher Boehm has this quote here saying that it's organized to be done by, typically, the kinsmen of the victim, because that means that inhibits a cycle of revenge killings. Now, this is at a time when we have already become highly domesticated, I think. So if we think about the ways in which this has happened over the evolutionary past, I think we have to go back into the deep past to think about this in a serious way. There are lots of hypotheses out there for why it is that humans are cooperative and tolerant, and sometimes people speak directly about a low aggressive species. And here are many of them listed. Now, the point I worry about is this, that many of these splendid ideas fail to deal with the problem of an incorrigibly aggressive male. So take female choice. People say, well, surely, the choice exerted by women in saying who they want to marry and have children with is going to have a big effect on the course of the kind of psychology that males show, because they will prefer to choose males who are not so aggressive. Yeah, that's okay, but what happens if the male just doesn't pay any attention and he rapes her and he takes her from other men? And we've got to go back in time to think that would have happened on a regular basis at a time when they were much more chimpanzee-like in their behavior, because that's the kind of thing that chimpanzees will do. There's an idea that weapons might have been a really significant advance in enabling people to conduct selective coalitionary proactive aggression, because it really helps to be able to organize 10 men surround one with their bows and arrows. But the thing about weapons is that it's pretty clear that weapons have gone on being used by species of humans long before Homo sapiens. So that's why it seems to me that language-based conspiracy is critical, and that around 300,000 years ago, a little bit earlier, our linguistic abilities became sufficiently skilled to be able to develop conspiracies with all the complexity of trying to dodge blame and recruit allies to be able to conduct safe killing of these previous alpha male tyrants with their big brow ridges and wide faces and willingness to be aggressive if we can trust the anatomy to tell us what was happening in the past. And from there, I think, we would have got self-domestication, because this would have selected against the reactive aggressors. And the self-domestication would be associated with the emergence of coalitions of egalitarian males. And these are coalitions that we, in many ways, I think, still see in our society today. One of the benefits of all this is that you get lots more cooperation within the group, because people who are trying to push their way through conflict are sort of held back and ultimately executed, but of course very often simply a word from the coalitional patriarchy will suffice. And I think that under the conditions in which in claustrophobic societies, somebody who is the tall poppy is in danger of being viewed as a witch, as an outsider, as ultimately the kind of person that's not good for society and therefore needs to be executed. Under those conditions, then there's going to be selection in favor of self-protective moral emotions, where there's a strong tendency to conform, ultimately because of the fear of execution. So I think the special power of human tribalism is going to be rooted in the fact that we have this tremendous evolution of conformity associated with our reduced aggressiveness. On the one hand, it's lovely that we have all of these strong group loyalties and relatively peaceful societies, compared to chimpanzees. And by the way, bonobos too are almost as aggressive as chimpanzees in terms of the frequency with which they fight. And on the other hand, you have the increased capacity for the groups uniting in a very conformist way in deciding who is an enemy and how to behave in relationship to them. So the key points I want to take you to go away with are that we are now a very unaggressive species compared to any other primate. And for 300,000 years, it seems likely that we've had selection pressure against that if you look at our bones. The community pressures that apparently selected against reactive aggression would also have favored group conformity, because it would be scary to be a nonconformist. And that, I think, has exaggerated our tribalistic psychology greatly through the evolution of new kinds of moral systems and moral emotions. Thank you very much.
So I want to thank our three amazing speakers. There's more coming. Just a couple of thoughts. First of all, for some reason, I just love the idea that there's a form of obsidian out there which is sharper than steel. There's something about that I found very, very pleasing, and I'm glad to know that little fact. And a slightly more complicated thought. We've been hearing about reactive and proactive aggression. Some of the things that lead to reactive aggression are insulting another person's family, their kin, their people. I was in a situation, in a very, very, if you will, tribal situation of very high violence. I was with a platoon of U.S. infantry in combat in eastern Afghanistan. Very, very clear who's the enemy, who is within our tribe, the group that I was with. And what was extraordinary about that, and I'm not sure if this has been studied or not, but what the guys did in such a a situation where the stakes were extremely high. They went through these sort of rituals to show that they're all in the same group. One of the things that they did is everyone got a nickname. Something that I'm not sure women do with each other, but men certainly do when they're bonded in groups. Everyone gets a nickname. It's an identifier. And the other thing that they do is this absolutely appalling form of insulting humor. And they will insult each other's mothers and sisters and the only thing that's off limits are girlfriends or wives. Everything else is fair game. And basically what they're doing, as far as I can tell, is that they're doing something to another guy in the coalition that if they did it to a stranger in a bar would absolutely be guaranteed to wind up in a fist fight. And they're doing it to each other, and the other guy just laughs. And that's how I think that's how they demonstrate to each other, listen, we are brothers, and if you don't punch me over what I just said about your sister, I know you'll die for me and I'll die for you. And that's how they reaffirm those bonds of the male coalition. Don't forget to turn in your question cards. Get more if you need them. We're going to have 3 more wonderful speakers. But right now we're going to take a 15-minute break, and so be back in your seats in 15 minutes. Thank you very much. Everybody? You ready for more learning? Welcome back. The second half of our program will be dedicated to the implications of tribalism for modern human thinking and for problem solving, and the transition from tribe to nation state. Speakers will be Mahjarine Banaji, Molly Crockett, Joshua Green, and Francis Fukuyama. Earlier I said there were three, there are four, obviously, speakers. Please welcome our first speaker, Mahjarine Banaji.
Of your tribalism and mine. And I thought, given that I'm in New York City, what better tribalism to study and to examine aloud than a baseball tribalism. And given how well the Yankees are doing this year, you should be feeling really great. And so we're going to do a test. And I'm going to need your participation. We're going to see words appear on a screen. They'll either belong to the category Red Sox or Yankees. And by the way, if you're a very strong Red Sox fan, like I am, be quiet during this demo. Do not participate at all, okay? But anybody who's a Yankee fan or just a New Yorker can. If you are a very, very serious Mets fan, then also be quiet, okay? But if you have a strong New York identity, then it should not be a problem for you to do this. So these are the words we'll use for the Yankees, Yankee Stadium, New York, and Babe Ruth. And for the Red Sox, we'll use equivalent words, Red Sox, Fenway Park, Boston, Massachusetts, and Ted Williams. Okay, so whether you're a baseball fan or not, this test should work. What we are going to do in this, I'm going to run a little program that will test how much you love the Yankees relative to the Red Sox. And the way it works is extremely simple. A word will pop up in the middle of the screen. It'll either be a Red Sox word or a Yankee word. If it's a Red Sox word, please rapidly and loudly say left, okay? If it's a Yankee word, rapidly and loudly say right. And when I say rapidly, I mean really rapidly. I mean like 700 milliseconds per item, okay? Which is faster than a second. Now to do this, you will make some mistakes, saying left instead of right and right instead of left. That's okay. Given the incredibly competitive people you are, you will likely stop doing this the first mistake you make. Don't do that, okay? Continue to say left and right and keep up with the trials so that you get a feeling for how your tummy and your brain are responding to this exercise. So is everybody ready? You have to go loud, you have to go fast. That's it. Say left for Red Sox words, say right for Yankees words. Ready? Go. Right. Excellent. Okay, you are doing really well. So 700 or lower is a great score. That means you're really doing fine. No need to tell you to speed up. This is a good speed. Now you're going to see words that mean good and bad things in the world. If you see a word like love, peace, joy, friend, sunshine, glorious, success, you will say left. But if you see words that mean obvious bad words in the lexicon, words like devil, bomb, war, vomit, awful, failure, you will say right. And do not become philosophers and say, but which war did you mean, and so on. Just say right. Okay, so you're going to be saying left for angel and right for devil, and that's all you have to do. Again, go fast and go loud. Let's see how well you do now. Ready? Go. Right, Excellent. Okay, very good. Again, well under 700, which is just fine. And now we just put them together. Whoops. Let me try something because I want you to get the full experience. And so I'm going to just do something to fix this so that you actually get the full Yankee good experience. And now we will do this. Let me just go forward. Yeah, now you're ready. Okay, so the test we're going to take is going to be a Yankees and good on the left, Red Sox and bad on the right, okay? So just think of it this way. Anything that's your identity or anything that is good gets a left. Everything else you just say right. Let's see how fast you go here, and this is obviously one of the crucial tests. Go as fast as you can. Ready? Go. Excellent. Okay, so think about this. This score is actually pretty amazing. Okay, you had to do something that was twice as hard as what you did, and you're still within good statistical range of what you did before. So remember the number 782, because that's going to be half the score that we're going to compute to measure your tribal love for the Yankees over the Red Sox. Okay, all right. And now that you've done this so well, we need not repeat it. Now we're going to just practice a switch. Now say left for Red Sox and right for Yankees. Ready? Easy to do. Go. Excellent. Woo, you're beating the speed of sound here. This is wonderful. Okay, and now for this last round, you're going to say left for Red Sox and good, and right for Yankees and bad. See, you're groaning already. I love human beings. They know before they're going to screw up that they're going to screw up. Okay? All right. So everybody ready? I'm going to go as loud as you can because I want to see how pathetic you are in this round. Okay. Go. Okay. So as a friend of mine said, you don't need a computer to measure this bias. A sundial will do. And I think that that is what we see. So why did I do this particular test with you today? And let's just go back and have a conversation for the few minutes that I have. I'm going to argue that belonging to tribes, as you've heard from the previous speakers, can be a very wonderful thing. What they focused on, though, were things like survival of the group, okay? And I've mentioned those as well. But I am interested in something that tribes do for us, and that is they make us work harder. They make us do better. They make us want to achieve more. So belonging to tribes can be a very, very wonderful thing. You know, as Michelangelo lay upside down painting a ceiling. Yes, I'm sure a large part of it had to do with his passion as an artist. But I also believe that he did it because he was a member of a guild. He was up there doing what he did because he cared about this tribe called artists in the same way as I care about a tribe called scientists or women in science. These are my tribes. Many of us belong to these tribes, and I believe that more than just thinking about the survival of the group, tribes get us out of bed in the morning, get us to work, and make us do lots of wonderful things, okay? So we know that, and tribes do that, and that's why I can't say to you, tribes are bad. Let's go into the brain and just lop off a piece of the brain. That's the tribal part of the brain, and we will be fine. Our difficulty is that the very thing that makes us succeed, the very thing that protects us, the very thing that we will give our lives for, is also the thing that not only harms us individually, but harms us as groups, and harms, right now, I would say, is likely to be harmful to the planet as a whole, and that's why we are here today. Because it's very easy to look at the good things tribes do, and I don't wish to undermine those at all. But today I want to focus on the aspect of tribes that I think you came here to talk about, and that is that tribes begin as very simple things that are almost neutral. There's always the us, and then there are simple neutral thems. And those thems can start to have words that we use to describe them, like resident alien. Okay? And then those words become a little bit stronger, like enemy, but then they become even more strong until it justifies a certain set of behaviors or actions that come from something as simple as them. And my job in my work is to look at that entire span from the thems all the way to thinking about why we would say, yes, it's important to exterminate them, for example. So when I gave you this test that you took, the Red Sox and Yankees test, is a lovely test, right? You loved showing preference for your own kind, okay? And the nice thing about it is that if I did this test in Boston, I would have gotten exactly the opposite result. Even more so because we're losing this year. And there's huge anger towards the Yankees this year. And we're really hoping they don't win the World Series. Just kidding. All right, so I'm here to tell you that when you take the test, I want you to do something that will require your imagination, and that is to replace the Yankees and Red Sox with other group names, and imagine how the test would have come out. Instead of Yankees and Red Sox, straight and gay, or dark-skinned and light-skinned, or elderly and young, or African and European, whatever. Pick any two and just plug them into that test. And now imagine taking the same test you just took. Our data show that if I gave you the race version, you would show an association, a faster association of good with white than with black. Okay? That you would show, if you were Christian, you would probably show stronger association of good with Christian than Hinduism or Buddhism or whatever it might be. This one is a weird one. Whether you are young or elderly, you'll show preference for the young. That's how deep the thumbprint of the culture is on our brain on that one. And I could go on and on and on and on, but that test, if I gave you one of those tests, there's nothing pleasurable about taking it. I had the most unique experience of taking one of my own tests in 1994, and knowing myself, I said, I know exactly how this is going to come out. I'm pretty neutral on this, so I took a race test. And it was as if my fingers were stuck on the keyboard, and I could not make them even move when I had to associate black and good and white and bad. The other was easy. I was going at 400 milliseconds on average, really fast. When it was white and good, not a problem. And when I first took that test, it was confronting an aspect of my mind that I was completely unfamiliar with, okay? And so my first thought was, something screwed up with the test. It can't be me. But we had built the test. This was our test. And a few seconds later, I realized certainly, that it wasn't the test that was screwed up, it was my brain that was screwed up. And by screwed up, I mean only one thing. There's no passing or failing score on the test. You only measure your performance on these tests by one standard. Where would you like to be? That's it, okay? You set the standard, and now you measure how close is your behavior on this test to that standard, because this behavior is revealing to you a little bit about what the culture has thumbprinted onto your brain, and it's not out there just in the culture. It is now in ourselves. So these variations that we've been studying have been incredibly interesting. The tests are available on a website. You go to implicit.harvard.edu, and you can take them yourselves. Many of you probably already have, because we have 30 million or so people who've taken these tests. And from these tests, I'm going to tell you that the data tell us that things are a lot worse than you would have thought. If I give you a little survey and I say, how do you feel about the X group? You and I are going to be, given our values, very moderate. We will say we like everybody. We like them all, okay? But if you begin to look below the surface, then one of the things you have to face is that it is a lot worse than we were thinking. And it is a lot worse in places like here and like Boston. I have a feeling that my friends in Boston have a view of the world that we're not the problem people. We were the first, the early abolitionists are from the city after all. Massachusetts is the first state that voted in gay marriage. So people there feel like there is a problem in this country, but it is sort of south of the Mason-Dixon line. And the Mason-Dixon line runs somewhere halfway in Connecticut. Okay? That's what they think. But I am here to tell you that this is universal. What we're detecting is everywhere, in every region of the country. I'm not saying they're all equal, but it is everywhere. So it's universal, it's you and me, and that generates a very different discussion than when we sit there and we pontificate about what's going on in the rest of the country while we are okay, right? These statistical effects are large. You cannot run away from them. They're huge, okay? You can't just say, oh, that's a little effect. It'll go away in a few years. Dominant groups, members of dominant groups show these biases even more in many cases. That is to say, if 75% of white Americans show a preference on the race test for white over black, we would say, maybe it would be fine then if it's going to be that way, then if black Americans, 75% of black Americans show the opposite effect, favoring black over white, then it's like the Yankees and the Red Sox test. The Yankee fans love the Yankees, the Red Sox fans love the Red Sox. It's opposite effects, but it's symmetric. There's equal love for each group for its own kind. But that is not the case when I talk about things like race or sexuality, okay? Straight people show much more positivity towards straight over gay. Gay people's attitudes, they're changing really fast, but they still are not at the same level as straight love for straight people, okay? And similarly for African Americans, and similarly for many disadvantaged groups. So on top of this tribalism, we have an uneven tribalism, and that might be worth our thinking about. We were stunned because 10 years ago I began to study toddlers. How early does this stuff begin? And I was certain that 3-year-olds will be free of it, and then by age 8 or 9 we'll begin to see it, and by adolescence it'll be in full bloom, because these require some learning. And I was just stunned by the data, and I've been talking about them ever since, because what we find is that this result, the one you just saw, is in full form in 3-year-olds. Okay? And I can tell you, if I had time, data on how infants begin to show preferences towards those of their own kind after the first month of life. Okay? So we need to know that. All of this is worth knowing, because the more we know about how bad it is, the harder we will have to work to figure out how to deal with it if it's in our interest, which I think people in this room will agree is. It emerges the drop of a hat. I don't have to do very much. I could slice this room in half and say, you guys on the right side are the righties, and you are the lefties, and give you a little test to do, and in 5 minutes, you will be at war with each other, and we can make that happen like that. This is what experimental psychologists are good at, and we didn't expect this. We created, many years ago, Henri Tajfel, a British psychologist, created something called the minimal group. He said, all we're going to do is tell them, you guys are overestimators, you are underestimators. And he found that in 5 minutes, the overestimators could be made to hate the underestimators and vice versa, restricting resources, giving more to their own kind, and so on. So this can be created extremely fast, which is how we understand some of the data that you saw from the previous speakers. And the signs of who is a member of your tribe can be very subtle. You can just be walking around in New York City, and across the way, you will see a shape and form that will please you or disgust you. You won't say you're disgusted by it because we're too genteel to say that. But somewhere in your brain, there could be a response that is a response of disgust. Okay? And I think we had better know that that's happening, so I'll give you a quick little and a sweet reminder of how subtle the cues can be that will tell you that you love somebody. Okay? And these have impact on us. Okay? So I'm told I have very few minutes, so I can't really tell you. Well, I was going to give you an example of my own bias where I show exactly this particular bias towards a liked other, but I will save that for the Q&A if you ask me. I gave you a message that said, it's worse than you think. And I am going to, in the last 3 minutes, also tell you that, as Niels Bohr said, the physicist said, the opposite of a great truth is also true. And so it is for tribalism. And not in the way in which I meant it, that there are good effects of good tribes and so on. I think bad tribalism is on the wane. And I know it's difficult to see that and to think it in this moment. We're not in a good moment in this country from my perspective at least, okay? We're seeing things that were hidden that have now come to the fore. And again, as an individual person, much as I detest seeing it, as a scientist, I'm actually glad that we're finding out what it is, because only if we know can we do something about it. So I do want to give you some data on why I think things are different. They are better than they were. I don't know how many people in this room. Oh, you're my age. Okay, all right, okay. So if you know Tom Lehrer, you remember that he sang a song in his nasal voice called National Brotherhood Week. But even the idea of National Brotherhood Week in the 60s sounds so bizarre to us today. Can you imagine New York having a National Brotherhood Week? I mean, we would just laugh at that, wouldn't we? Because time has passed, and even things we thought that were so cool and so nice suddenly seem outdated. But I'll read to you in, I hope, a Tom Lehrer-like nasal voice, the lovely line he said to sort of show that we've made progress and that we haven't. I know there are people in the world who do not love their fellow human beings, and I hate people like that. So we are getting better. This is a gate at my university, at Harvard. You exit, as you're exiting Harvard Yard and into the square, you will read these words printed by President Eliot not too long ago: "Depart to serve better thy country and thy kind." Like, those last two words have always been intriguing to me. What did President Eliot have in mind when he said, "Dear Harvard people, go out there and serve their kind"? And I have all these images of presidents dressed in weird costumes that he might have had in mind when he said, "Go out there and serve your kind." We would never. We don't think that way anymore. So I want you to know that things are better, that we have given up not only ways of thinking from 10,000 years ago and 500 years ago, but even 40 years ago and 50 years ago. We are changing. If I had a little more time, I would tell you about a result that has both sides of this. Things are bad and things can be really good because our brains are malleable. They're changeable. We can initially demonstrate, as we did in an experiment we did, my colleague Jason Mitchell and I, in which we demonstrated that when we think about similar others, we use a set of neurons that these are in a region that you don't have to remember the name. This is a region that we would call ventral medial prefrontal cortex. That's a region that we would label dorsal medial prefrontal cortex. And when you think about similar others, the ones who are in your tribe, in this case politically in your tribe, you use these neurons to think about them. So liberals use these to think about other liberals, and conservatives to think about other conservatives. So don't leave this room saying Mazarin told us something about Republican and Democratic neurons. That is not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that there are certain neurons that do get activated when you, a conservative, let's say, is thinking about the mind of another conservative, and you have to think about their future and their life and so on. But you, the conservative, will not use those same neurons to think about an identical other in every other way, but who happens to be liberal. And liberals will do the reverse, okay? So first we see this. This is a scary result, that our brain, unbeknownst to us, is actually assigning different parts of neural real estate to think about people who happen to be a little similar or dissimilar from us. But I can also tell you that later experiments we did, well, we had people in the People's Republic of Cambridge think about what would life be like for a fundamentalist Christian, family to move here and to have to live here and to find a church and to find a school and to find a neighborhood. You can do this for 5 minutes and all of this can become purple. Who was other can become self. Right? But not without that attempt, and not if you assume that you can leave it as the default. So the last bit of data I want to tell you about are data that I have been very happy about, even though they're not just good messages in it. And I'm happy because we have existence proof that we are changing. Take the Red Sox and Yankees test. Imagine that test, exactly that test, done more precisely on a computer with people. And know that we can have a test on gay good, straight bad, or the other way, straight, whichever way it was, the opposite way. So that's the sexuality test. You know, in 2007, this is the level of bias on that test, and it's an anti-gay bias. That is, most people will associate straight with good and gay with bad. But take a look at this change over time. In 10 years, Americans have changed by an amount that is almost unbelievable. And not in what they're just mouthing to us, but in what they're showing on this test, a test where they can't quite control their reaction. And even on such a test, we're seeing a movement towards neutrality. Our forecasting models predict that in about 20 years, if this trend continues, we will be at neutral on the sexuality. In 20 years, okay? That's fast. We do not see fast change for race, but we are seeing a change. A 17% drop in whatever it was, black bad, white good, is dropping off towards neutrality. Same with skin tone. I don't have time to go into these. These are the sad tests. Nothing changing for age bias, nothing changing for disability, and body weight bias becoming even worse. We really think people who are overweight are really bad, okay? Even more than we did 10 years ago. So this is a full set of data telling us that our tribalisms, or whatever you want to call them, in-group, out-group relations and feelings, there is evidence that we can change. So we need to ask. So I've been spending most of my time these days thinking about everything that makes sexuality different, unique, that is producing this kind of change. I can talk about that endlessly, but those are my speculations. But I want you to take these data away and to know that we are seeing evidence of something amazing happening. And the fact that it can happen to me is so remarkable that I'm willing to now say, if we could apply whatever is going on here, we can, if we bring our prefrontal cortex to bear on these decisions and these choices. You may know this face, may not. It's the 13th century Sufi poet by the name of Rumi. And Rumi said something in a longer poem that I've always treasured as sort of my evolving view of human nature. He said something like this: every single one of us is a jackass, but with the wings of angels tacked onto us. And I think we have both of these. I have spent the last 40 years of my career studying the jackass part of ourselves. Every study I did showed that humans really sucked. But in the last few years, there has been evidence suggesting that we are attempting to figure this out, and we're attempting to be better. And I just want to end by saying, what better city could I be making this point in than your city? That this is a city like no other. That this is a city that, no matter what its problems and what its challenges, has demonstrated to us that we can demolish old tribalisms in a way in which I don't think any other city in the world has done. And I, as an immigrant, can say it with a passion greater than many of you. So with that, I'm going to say thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for having me. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Molly Crockett. I'm an assistant professor of psychology at Yale University. In January this year, a video was posted online featuring a group of students from Covington Catholic High School in Kentucky. In the video, the students appeared to be taunting a Native American man while wearing that iconic symbol of the conservative tribe, red hats declaring "Make America Great Again," or MAGA. Over the next few days, the video clip went viral as members of the liberal tribe expressed outrage on social media. A congressman called for a ban on teens wearing MAGA hats. Celebrities and journalists demanded the kids be named and shamed. Some even wished them physical harm. Then, in the midst of the uproar, a longer video emerged, suggesting the incident was more complicated than originally thought. Here's the New York Times. Fuller picture emerges of viral video. And CNN. A new video shows a different side of the encounter. Some journalists expressed remorse for how they'd reported the story. This one's from The Atlantic. "I failed the Covington Catholic test. Next time there's a viral story, I'll wait for more facts to emerge." These mea culpas were met with more outrage, this time from conservatives. And some weeks later, one of the students sued the Washington Post for defamation to the tune of $250 million. Now, this story, just like every story, has unique features. But a lot about this story is starting to feel more and more like just another typical day in America. It seems like we can hardly go 5 minutes without a new episode of tribal outrage erupting in the public sphere. And if you spend any time on social media, you might feel like we're locked in a state of perpetual outrage. And there seems to be a growing sense that social discourse around moral and political issues in this country has become quite unproductive, and that social media might be at least partly to blame. Now, there are many opinions out there about moral outrage in the digital age. In the wake of the Covington Catholic incident, Twitter was declared the crystal meth of newsrooms. Some journalists advocated leaving Twitter altogether, and pundits have even suggested that outrage itself is addictive. But the reality is that there's very little data that bears on these sweeping claims about morality and social media. And gathering this data is imperative because right now, our government is deciding whether and how to regulate tech companies on the basis of what their products might be doing to our mental health, our social relationships, and our democracy. Just yesterday, representatives from Facebook, Google, and Twitter testified before Congress on harmful online content. And legislative decisions on this topic in the next few years will change the course of our society, for better or for worse. In my lab at Yale, we've been studying how social media might be changing the way we experience and express moral outrage. Now, what is moral outrage? Broadly, we can consider it to be a mixture of anger and disgust at the violation of a moral standard. Now, people don't just want to sit alone with their outrage, they want to express it. They're motivated to shame and punish the wrongdoer, especially when other people are watching. And expressing outrage is effective in the sense that being the target of shaming and punishment makes people less likely to transgress in the future. Now, the fact that outrage discourages bad behavior suggests one way that outrage could have evolved, by promoting cooperation within social groups. Those groups, with more people willing to shame and punish wrongdoers, would be more successful than less moralistic groups. But in addition to benefiting groups, outrage also benefits those individuals who express it. People who express outrage are more likely to be trusted and chosen as social partners than people who don't. So expressing outrage benefits individuals by boosting their social reputation. And these benefits of outrage and moralistic punishment are encoded in the brain's reward circuitry, which becomes more activated when people punish moral violations compared to when they turn the other cheek. Notably, this same brain circuitry is activated when people are craving other kinds of rewards, like delicious foods, or for those people who are addicted, cocaine. These psychological and neural mechanisms for outrage evolved in the context of small face-to-face interactions in groups of hunter-gatherers many thousands of years ago, like we heard about earlier. But much of our social discourse now takes place online in much larger networks than ever before in human history. I've been studying the neurobiology of moral outrage for more than a decade, but in 2016, in the wake of Brexit and Trump, I started thinking about how the modern context of social media might be changing the nature of moral outrage, with potentially far-reaching consequences for social life. My hypothesis is built around a very simple theory about how we learn from rewards and adapt our behavior. Moral outrage is triggered by stimuli that call attention to moral norm violations. People express outrage with a range of responses that vary in their costs. And expressing outrage leads to a variety of personal and social outcomes, which then reinforce the responses, making them more likely to occur in the future. This simple framework can help us to organize the many ways in which social media might be changing the costs and benefits of moral outrage. Let's start by talking about how social media alters the stimuli that trigger outrage in us. One feature of social media that's relevant here is its business model. So platforms like Facebook and Twitter make more money the longer they hold our attention, so their newsfeed algorithms prioritize content that draws the most engagement. And research has shown that the most engaging content is emotional content, especially moral emotions. Bill Brady and colleagues recently showed that for a variety of political issues, tweets containing moral emotion words like hate, attack, destroy are more likely to go viral. So every word like this in a tweet increases its likelihood of being retweeted by 20%. The implication of this is that if newsfeed algorithms are selecting for engagement, this creates an information ecosystem that's promoting the most outrageous content, which might be artificially inflating our everyday experiences of outrage. To test this idea, I analyzed some data from a study conducted by Will Hoffman and colleagues. And in this study, about 1,200 participants were messaged on their smartphones at random times, 5 times a day over 3 days. And they were asked to report their recent experiences, including whether they had learned about any immoral acts in the past hour, and if so, where they learned about it and how they felt about it. By analyzing this data, I was able to determine where people are most likely to learn about immoral events, or in other words, the kinds of events that typically trigger moral outrage. And what I found is that people are encountering outrage-triggering events more often online than in person or through traditional forms of media like print, TV, or radio. And by analyzing how people felt when they learned about these immoral events, I found that people experienced more intense outrage in response to events they encountered online than what they encountered in person or through traditional forms of media. So people are experiencing outrage more often and more intensely in response to online than offline content. Next, let's take a look at how social media transforms the expression of moral outrage. If we want to express outrage offline, we have a few options. We can gossip about the wrongdoer, or we can directly confront them, either verbally or physically. And these latter methods, of course, require more effort, and they also carry potential physical risks. But online, we can express outrage with a few keystrokes. We can post angry comments, either directly to the target or to a broader audience. We can do this from the comfort of our bedrooms. And it's clear that all of these responses require far less effort than expressing outrage offline. And the risks of retaliation are, of course, reduced because you're behind a screen or hiding in a large crowd. So if we think of outrage expression as a kind of cost-benefit decision, the hypothesis is that social media reduces some of the costs of expressing outrage. And what this means is that for any given person, their threshold for expressing outrage is likely to be lower online than offline. Now, I really want to emphasize this in itself isn't necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. It's complicated. So reduced costs might mean that marginalized voices find it easier to express outrage at injustice while facing fewer physical threats. I think Me Too and Black Lives Matter are good examples of this. But on the other hand, reduced costs of expression might also in some cases lead to disproportionate levels of punishment. Finally, the way that outcomes are delivered on social media might make our expressions of outrage more mindless or habitual. So responding to moral violations with outrage is the best way to get likes and shares, and these social rewards are delivered at unpredictable times, a pattern of reward delivery that's known as variable reinforcement, and this is well known to promote the formation of habits. Casinos use this kind of reward delivery pattern to keep gamblers hooked on slot machines. So habits are behaviors that are expressed without concern for their consequences. So just as a habitual snacker reaches for the bag of chips without actually feeling hungry, a habitual online shamer might express outrage without actually feeling very outraged. In my lab, we've been exploring all these questions. And to do this, we needed to build a new tool for measuring outrage on social media. We've been collecting tens of millions of tweets from a variety of episodes of viral public outrage, including the Covington Catholic example I opened with, as well as the Brett Kavanaugh Supreme Court hearings, Jussie Smollett's faked hate crime by Trump supporters, Trump's decision to ban transgender individuals from the military, and United Airlines violently dragging a passenger off an overbooked flight. With this data, we've been building an AI that can measure expressions of outrage online. We're calling it the Digital Outrage Classifier, and we can feed it millions of tweets, and it will determine whether each tweet expresses outrage or not. Here are a couple of examples of tweets categorized by our classifier from the Kavanaugh Supreme Court hearings last year. This one, it says, is outrage. And this one, it says, is not. It does pretty well. Using this classifier, we've been testing a hypothesis that the more your social network rewards you for expressing outrage, the more likes and shares you get, the more likely you then become to express outrage in the future. So in other words, if you express outrage today in a tweet, and you get a lot of likes and shares for it, does that make you more likely to express outrage tomorrow? Now, this work is still ongoing. It's in progress, so I can't share just any more with you today. But so far, the data are very consistent with our hypotheses. And so for the rest of my time here, I'm going to zoom out and talk a little bit about some of the implications should our predictions continue to be borne out in our data. Now, recall that outrage has both social and personal benefits. We think that social media might be amplifying some of the personal benefits while at the same time potentially reducing some of the social benefits. It amplifies the personal benefits by dramatically extending the reach of moral signals. So, for example, if you hear somebody make a sexist comment and you tell them off for it in person, you only get credit for that from whoever happens to be watching at the moment, which is probably not that many people. But if you express outrage about that same sexist remark on social media, you broadcast your moral character to your entire social network. That might be thousands or even millions of people. And you can expect a big pile of likes and retweets as other people want to chime in and signal that they agree with you. And we think this is especially true in a political context where people want to signal that they are good tribe members to the rest of the tribe. But personal benefits of outrage aside, it remains an open question whether digital outrage is good for society. One potential drawback is a worse ability to coordinate our punishment. If one function of outrage is to point out those actions or people who are deserving of punishment, lowering the threshold for expressing outrage could muddy that signal, making it more difficult for people to align their behavior. If everything is worthy of outrage, effectively, nothing is. Another potential bad consequence is that outrage might be facilitating the spread of disinformation and propaganda online. Bad actors who want to spread this kind of content seem to know, either intuitively or explicitly, that newsfeed algorithms are prioritizing outrageous content. So here are a few examples of Facebook ads sponsored by the Russian government in 2016. You can see how much moral emotional language and outrage-provoking language are in these ads. We're currently testing in my lab whether outrage is indeed more prevalent in false news compared to real news. And if this is true, outrage expressions could serve as a potential behavioral marker for disinformation and propaganda that's at risk of going viral. Finally, we're looking at whether the social reinforcement of outrage online might explain the rise in political polarization that we've seen in recent years. And there are a couple of different ways that this might happen. First of all, if more politically extreme users are expressing more outrage than politically moderate users, and these expressions get amplified by the newsfeed algorithms, then more moderate users might feel pressure to chime in. And then, of course, they'll get rewarded by their social network. If they internalize these rewards, then over time, this could push people in the middle towards the extremes. But people don't even necessarily need to feel more outrage to appear polarized to their peers. If social media decouples the expression of outrage from its experience, people might falsely believe that others are more outraged than they actually are, and be less willing to engage in bipartisan discussions on the basis of these false beliefs. Our data so far suggests that if moral outrage is a fire, social media is like gasoline. Technology companies have been arguing that their products provide neutral platforms for social behaviors, but don't fundamentally change those behaviors. Of course, this is an empirical question, and the data that we need to answer it already exists, but not all of it is publicly available. These data can and should be used to understand how new technologies, like social media, might be transforming moral emotions from a force for collective good into a tool for collective self-destruction. We'll be releasing more results soon at digitaloutrageproject.org. You can sign up for our mailing list if you want to follow along. I want to thank our team, Billy Brady, a postdoc in my lab who's leading this work, Killian McLaughlin, our research technician, Tuan Duan, a Yale undergraduate thesis student, our funders, NSF, Democracy Fund, Social Science One, and our volunteers and colleagues who've given us feedback on our work, and of course you for your attention. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Josh Green, and I'm a professor in the psychology department at Harvard University. And today I'm going to talk to you about some new research using what we call epistemic cooperation to combat political tribalism. It's not an accident that we're having this symposium on tribalism here today. Many of us have the sense that our democracy here in the United States and other democracies abroad are under intense strain, and that tribalism, great animosity between political groups and cultural groups, is an important part, if not the defining part, of the problem. This is not an entirely new problem, but it seems to have come to a head recently. But over the last 20 years in the United States, Republicans and conservatives have been developing increasingly negative attitudes about each other, to the point where on the eve of the 2016 election, and it's only gotten worse since then, Republicans and Democrats, both majority, say that they have unfavorable views of the other party. Okay, well, so as you've heard, it seems that this kind of political animosity is fundamentally a moral psychological phenomenon. And so I want to start with what I see as the beginning, the core of morality, and see if we can work our way up to at least a pathway towards a solution to the problem that we would all like to see solved. Okay, so we begin with a parable that comes from an ecologist named Garrett Hardin that was told about 50 years ago, and I think illustrates the fundamental problem of morality. So here we have a group of herders who share this pasture, and these are rational, self-interested herders straight out of the Harvard economics department. And every so often they say to themselves, should I add more animals to my herd? And they think, well, more animals, more money for me when I take my herd to market, so that's good. What's the downside? Well, not much. They're just grazing on this common pasture. So all of these herders think, well, I'll add more animals to my herd. But at some point, there are more animals on the herd than the pasture can support. And then all of the animals end up dying, and everybody ends up being worse off. And this is known as the tragedy of the commons. And from my point of view and that of a lot of other social scientists, this really illustrates the fundamental problem of social life. That is, individuals, if they do what's best for them as individuals, if they only pursue self-interest, then everybody ends up being worse off, whether it's about sharing a common resource like a pasture, or whether it comes to violence and using violence to get what you want. The fundamental, basic moral problem is the problem of me versus us. What's the solution to the problem? I would say that morality is the basic general solution that we have to this problem. It's what enables us to live together and to survive better as a result of our common association. Okay, so let's dig inside the moral mind for a bit. I want to tell you about an experiment that I did with David Rand and Martin Novak some years ago. We did the laboratory version of the tragedy of the commons, which is known as the public goods game. So we have, let's say, 4 people come into the lab. We can also do this online. And everybody gets $10 up front. And then they're told, and they're only going to do this once, they're told you can keep all of your $10 or you can give some or all of it into a common pool. Anything that goes into the common pool, we're going to double, and we're going to divide evenly among all 4 of you. You get to decide what you want to do. Now, if you do the math, what you realize is that you come away with the most money if you keep all of your money. Because if you keep your $10, then you get your $10, and you get your share of whatever other people put in and then got doubled and divided equally among everybody. So the me thing to do is to keep your money. And the us thing to do, the thing that expands the pie the most for everybody, is to put all of your money in. You can do anything in between. And we wanted to try to get at the psychology of what makes people me-ish versus us-ish in the following way. So first we had, in one version of this, we had people make this decision where they can just make it as quickly or as slowly as they want. And that's what I'm showing here. In this particular version, a little over 55% of people, people on average contributed about 55% of their initial endowment. When we told people, you have to decide quickly, you have to decide in under 10 seconds, then what we see is that cooperation goes up. And when we told people, you have to decide slowly, you have to take at least 10 seconds to think about it, cooperation goes down. So what this suggests is that, at least for these people in this kind of context, cooperation is the intuitive thing to do. You push people to decide quickly, and they go with their gut, and they're nice. And if you make people stop and think slowly, they think, yeah, I'd like to help, but I don't want to get the short end of the stick here, so maybe I won't do it. Now, you might think, okay, so what this means is that people are innately good or innately cooperative. But the story, as I'm sure you'd guess if you thought about it, is a lot more complicated than that. And I'll give you a version of this experiment that speaks to that complexity. So in one version of this experiment, we asked people, what do you think of the people who you interact with in your everyday life? Do you trust them or not? And we divided people down the middle into the people who mostly said that they trust the people they interact with and the people who said they don't. If you look at the people who say, I generally trust the people I interact with in my daily life, those people showed a big effect of this kind. That is, when they decide quickly, they put in a lot of money. When they decide slowly, they're more likely to put in less. If you look at the people who say, you know, I don't trust the people around me, them, whether they go fast or whether they go slow, it doesn't matter. It's like their first thought is, I'm keeping my money, and their second thought is, I'm keeping my money, and so it doesn't really matter if they go fast or if they go slow. And what this suggests is that it's not, we may have an innate capacity for cooperation, but our experience of whether or not we've done well by trusting people or not trusting people, or some people rather than others, this very much shapes the way we're going to play the game in the lab, and we think this shapes the way people play the game of life more generally. And this is really illustrative of a more general pattern, where the way we solve the basic me versus us problem is with intuitions and with emotions. And here you can see the sort of 2x2 chart where we have positive emotions and negative emotions. You can think of these as the carrots and sticks that drive our behavior. And we have emotions that apply to ourselves to make us good cooperative herders, and we have emotions that apply to other people. For example, if you out there are not a good herder, then you will have my anger and my disgust. And a la Richard Wrangham's talk, people will be more likely to be cooperative, although some people may never get the message. But this is the basic way it seems that human sociality and human morality operates, with intuitive emotions that help us solve the me versus us problem. But modern life is more complicated than the life of a simple tribe on a single pasture. So I want to give you my sequel to Garrett Hardin's tragedy of the commons. So over here, let's say, we have this herd, and these are, let's say, your communist herders. They have a single pasture, and they also have a single herd, one for all and all for one. And that's one way to solve the me versus us problem. Over here, we have a different tribe. These are your free market capitalist herders, right? And they say, we're not going to have a common herd, and we're not going to have a common pasture. We're going to pass legislation that will privatize the pasture, and we are going to cooperate by respecting each other's property rights. A different way of cooperating. And you can have groups with different religions, groups with different rituals, different ideas about who's allowed to be a herder. Are you allowed to defend your herd with an assault weapon? Are we going to have collective health insurance for ourselves and our sheep? All of these questions about how to organize a tribe, groups can be cooperative in different ways under different terms. And now let's imagine that with these tribes, one hot, dry summer, the forest burns to the ground, and then the rains come, and there's this lovely pasture in the middle. And both tribes look at this new pasture, and they say, nice pasture. And they move in. And the question is, what's going to happen here? Well, one thing that could happen, something that happened a lot in human history, is that one tribe just murders the other tribe. But in the modern world, we have, to varying extents, found ways for different tribes to live together. And this is the modern moral problem. It's not a simple problem of me versus us, of being selfish versus being moral, but it's a problem of competing moralities, of different groups with different interests and different values trying, with varying degrees of success, to exist in the same space. And this is where we have a hard time getting it together, although we have had a lot more success than people give us credit for. So as Mahzarin Banaji mentioned, our tribalistic tendencies often work against us. You can put people into groups randomly, and all of a sudden they'll start showing a bias for the me group rather than them, even though these groups are based on almost nothing. Other research has shown that very young children, babies, are listening for native versus foreign accents and would prefer, for example, to take a toy or even to look at someone who has a native accent rather than a foreign accent. This is inspired by a famous story in the Bible where one group identified members of another group by how they pronounced the certain word, the word shibboleth, and sort of use that as a cue to tribal identity. And as we've also discussed, you can see our tribal identities come through in our attitudes about things like sports. Okay, so how do we do better? I want to start by taking a cue from a famous experiment done by Muzaffar Sharif in the 1950s. So he had this very simple and in some ways intuitive idea, which is that the source of conflict is actual competition. It is fighting for scarce material resources. If you want people to dislike each other, put them in a situation where they have something to fight over. And if you want people to like each other, well, you're going to have to do something different. So to test this idea, he created this boys' camp in Oklahoma's Robbers Cave State Park was the name of the place. And he divided the boys into two groups. They self-named themselves as the Eagles and the Rattlers, and he set them into a series of competitions. And with perhaps a little bit of nudging from Sharif himself, as expected, the boys became the tribes, the Eagles and the Rattlers became pretty antagonistic towards each other, often physical fights, ransacking of the opponent bunks, etc. And at the end of the summer, he wanted to put his theory to the test and say, well, what do I have to do to bring these groups together? And what he did was he gave them a shared task. He said things like, there's this truck with food for the entire camp, but it's stuck, and the only way we can get it unstuck is if everybody, the Eagles and the Rattlers, work together to pull the stuck truck out and bring the food to the dining hall. And so boys, after doing this, different kinds of these cooperative tasks, eventually those tribal identities melted away and they were much more friendly towards each other. Okay, so it's a nice story in this sort of engineered environment, but can we actually put this to work in a meaningful way? That's what I'm mostly going to be talking about today, but I just wanted to mention this is not a new idea. It's not unique to Sharif. Gordon Allport's famous theory of the contact hypothesis. Bring groups together under cooperative circumstances, they're more likely to like each other. The jigsaw classroom and education, seeds of peace, bringing Israeli and Palestinian youth together. All of these ideas are getting at a similar principle. And then in history and political science, the idea that trading partners don't go to war with each other. When there's mutual cooperation with mutual benefit, you tend to have less animosity and more goodwill. Okay. Now, you can actually think of this not just as a theory of conflict, but actually as a theory of all of human history. And my favorite sort of exposition of this idea is in Robert Wright's book, Non-Zero, in which he argues that really all of human history, or even all of natural history, is the story of cooperation at increasingly complex levels, starting with cells joining together to form larger groups of cells that we think of as animals, and all the way up to the modern era, where we have, believe it or not, had a lot more peace than we have in the past. Perhaps after hearing some anthropologists, you'll believe it, but most people don't. Okay, so this brings us to the present moment, where we have a long history of shared prosperity, larger and larger scale cooperation, with larger and larger benefits for a larger and larger group of people. But something, especially in the United States, has happened in the last few decades that has challenged that trend. So what I'm showing you here is a graph of a few different economic measures, most notably gross domestic product, and median household income in the silver lines and the green lines. And what you see is that from the early 50s to the early 80s, these two lines moved pretty much closely together. And then something happened in the early 80s where these lines started to come apart, and they've come farther and farther apart. And what this basically means is that the American pie has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, but a typical person's slice of that pie has not gotten bigger. And the effect is even more extreme for people who do not have a college education. And a lot of us think that this is really the deep driving economic force behind the kind of tribal animosity that we see in US politics today. So how do you fix that? What do you do when this kind of shared prosperity starts to dissipate? So I want to now tell you about some new research that I'm very excited about. I should say that all of this is unpublished work that has not yet been peer reviewed, so you can take it with a grain of salt. But I think it's important to get these ideas out there. And this is work done with my wonderful collaborator, Evan De Philippis, trying to put sort of the idea of shared benefit, shared prosperity, mutually beneficial cooperation to work in a way that's designed to address the problems of the present moment. So what Evan and I did was we designed a quiz game where we can have liberals and conservatives play as partners online. And the quiz is designed to create a kind of mutual benefit. So what happens? They sign up to just do a quiz game. They don't know that it's anything about politics. And the first thing we do is we have them do an info sheet. So what's your favorite color? Who did you vote for in the last election? Where would you rather vacation, the mountains or the ocean? We give them a whole bunch of different questions. And then we say, OK, you've been paired up with this other person. Get to know your partner. You can and then you take a quiz on the other person's info. So among other things, you know the other person's politics. In the control conditions, we have people paired with people who are like-minded, so Democrats with Democrats, Republicans with Republicans. But in the interesting case, we have teams, pairs, made up of a Democrat and a Republican. And once they've gotten to know each other, they're paired with a little chat box, and they get quiz questions, and they have to answer the questions together. They get money for right answers, they lose money for wrong answers, and they can register their private opinions, but they have to agree on a joint answer, and that's what's going to determine their payoff. And economically, in this game, they rise or they fall together. So in the first part of the quiz, we make it nice. We make them like each other, and we make them like the quiz. So we ask them questions like, what state is Mount Rushmore in? And usually one of them knows. They chat about it. I think it's North Dakota. I think it's South Dakota. And they agree, and they most often get those things right. And then in the second quiz, Evan did a ton of research to try to figure out what do conservatives know that liberals don't, and what do liberals know that conservatives don't that's not specifically about politics? So you're already laughing. You know where this is going. So New York, tell me, raise your hand if you know the name of the family on the show Duck Dynasty. Okay, so we got one of those, but I don't see a lot of hands going up. On the other hand, how many of you watch the show Stranger Things? Right? So we see a few more, right? So we found, Evan found, I should say, these sort of places where liberals know something that conservatives don't, and conservatives know something that liberals don't, but again, it's not about politics. And so we create this kind of complementarity where not only are they playing together, but they're likely to really benefit from and depend on each other. And then we ease into the most interesting part of the quiz, where we ask them questions that are not directly about politics, but where there's a strong kind of political bias. So an example question would be, what percentage of gun deaths in 2016 were caused by assault-style rifles? So let me show you, the gun isn't normally there, but otherwise this is what you would see in a chat box. So you get this question, what percentage of gun deaths were caused by assault-style rifles? The right answer is 2%. Most liberals seem to think it's a lot. They'll typically say 35% and congratulate themselves for not saying 56%. So here's an example of a chat between a liberal and a conservative trying to address this question. So the liberal says, oh, it has to be a big number. The conservative says, no, I remember it being really small. 2%? Ah, but what about mass shootings? And the conservative says, that's a small part of gun deaths. And the liberal says, okay, I'll put 2%, I'll agree with you, and I'll put 35% for my private answer, not the one that counts for the money. They get the answer, they learn that the conservative is right, and now you have this liberal cheering the fact that this conservative was right about guns and that he or she was wrong. Okay, so this is what we're looking for in this game. And the question is, after playing this game with someone from the other side, what does it do to your attitudes, not just towards the person you're playing, but perhaps to the outgroup overall? So we use what they call a feeling thermometer. How cold or warm on a scale of 0 to 100 do you feel about Republicans or do you feel about Democrats? Here we're asking about the outgroup for each person. And in the control group, you can see that these lines are flat. That is to say, before the quiz, after the quiz, the warmth, the feeling about the outgroup doesn't go up. They start out low and they stay pretty low. But if you played the game with a member of the outgroup, then after playing the game, your feelings of warmth go up. And we see this for the Democrats, and we see this for the Republicans. And this is this side of the graph is all the participants. If you look at the strong partisans only, in some cases the effect is actually stronger. So people are colder, and then you see the lines go, in the case of the Republicans, way up. That is, the people on the far side actually show a bigger move, at least in this data set. And while this is new research, we have replicated this effect in a second set, this time only using strong partisans. So this is the flat lines for the control group. The attitudes are not warming up, but when Democrats play with a Republican, it warms up. When Republicans play with a Democrat, it warms up. Okay, well that's good. That's people expressing more positive attitudes with words. But what about something where you have to put your money where your mouth is? So another thing that we did in these experiments is we asked people, we say, at the end of the game, when you're done with your partner, we say, we're going to give you $1, and you can give your $1 to any amount of your $1, all of it or none of it, to your partner. And anything you give, we're going to multiply by 2. Okay? And so the question is, how much are you willing to give to the other person? So to give you an idea of a baseline, in an earlier version of this where there was no quiz game, no cooperation, we just paired, say, 2 conservatives together online and did the $1 thing, they'll give about 40 cents on the dollar on average. For Democrats paired with each other, in this sample at least, they have 60 cents on the dollar on average. That's not the main point. You're all snickering. The main point is this. What happens after people play the game, either with an outgroup partner or with an in-group partner? And what we see so far is that the game is special sauce. You pour it on, and it makes everybody nice to everybody, regardless of whether or not you played with somebody on an outgroup or in-group. Statistically, these are all the same, and they're all much higher. Or to put this in the most dramatic terms, a Republican who just played with a Democratic partner will give almost twice as much to that Democrat than the Republican would have given to a fellow Republican without playing the game. So the game, cooperating with that individual, just swamps the effect of politics. Politics goes out the window, and you're just thinking about this person who you cooperated with. Okay, but that's a feeling about the person you just played with. But for this to really do something in terms of society, you can't have everybody play with everybody. Is this going to spread to the group overall? And so in the most recent version, we said, you have $1 and you can divide it between some other Democrat and some other Republican online. So what happens there in our control conditions where you have Democrats who play with Democrats and then are asked about giving to a random Republican, or Republicans who have played with other Republicans and are asked about giving to a random Democrat, you can see where the levels are. But if you played with an outgroup partner, then you're more likely to give more, to get closer to equality with some other person from the other group, not someone who you played with. And this is putting your money where your mouth is. And this experiment was done only with people who identified themselves as strong partisans. So this is not just cherry picking the warm and fuzzies when it comes to intertribal attitudes. So it seems like having this kind of experience can change your attitude towards the outgroup, and in a way where it involves a real cost and a real benefit. I just want to show you, just to give you an example, because this is done online and you might think that it's this very stilted, weird environment, and in a sense it's very unnatural. But I want to show you just how sort of real these human interactions are. So this is not a typical case. This is a 50-year-old black professor who describes himself as extremely conservative, maybe not what you'd expect, and then a 32-year-old white male who is also a little person. And they're getting this question about what percentage of pediatricians believe that exposure to violent video games increases the level of aggression in children. So our conservative says, Halo Infinite, baby. That's referring to the violent video game Halo. And then the liberal says, boy. So 90, they're pretty prissy when it comes to most everything. Prissy equals safe. Then call me prissy, or should I call you doctor? They're palling around. Top right has our running total of the bonus. They get the answer. They find out that they're right. And our conservative says, boom, we are goddamn warriors murdering this game. Laughing my friendly ass off. So just to give you a sense that these people really do get emotionally engaged in these things, and it really is a kind of personal experience. And you should see some of the comments that we get from people. Okay, so back to the arc of human history. We have a lot of cooperative history behind us, and it seems like, at least in this country, that shared prosperity is not what it used to be. And the question is, how are we going to start pulling it together as a country and return that sense of shared prosperity? Now, I've shown you a very micro example of this. This is a kind of proof of principle on the level of two individuals from across the divide. And so far, at least, it seems like it can work pretty well. And the big question is, how do you take that feeling of goodwill that comes from working together and having that shared benefit, and how do we scale that up so that it can save our country and other nations that are suffering under the kind of tribalism that is tearing us apart? So thanks very much, and looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Oh, and I forgot to thank my lab and Evan De Filippis and Beyond Conflict for supporting this work.
My name is Francis Fukuyama. I'm a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute at Stanford University. I'm in this somewhat difficult position of being the last speaker in, I think, what's been a very rich but rather long series of presentations. Not only that, I was asked to do two presentations. The original one was really a historical view of where tribalism fits in the evolution of human societies, which is something that I've looked at some length, but then also to relate it to the contemporary world and the rise of populism, global populism. And so I'm going to try to do both of those, but in the interest of the lateness of the hour, I'm going to try to do it as expeditiously as I can. All right? So tribalism has been used in the contemporary discussion of world politics as a very broad term, meaning anybody that identifies with an in-group and doesn't like an out-group. I think that's such a broad definition, it becomes not all that useful. I, for historical purposes, have a much more specific definition of tribalism, which is a society that is organized into lineage segments based on descent from a common ancestor. And as some of the anthropologists earlier today said, oftentimes that is located as a stage of historical development between band-level societies, which are usually genetic relatives, maybe 50 altogether. That's the way Richard Wrangham's chimps organized themselves, wedged between that kind of society and state-level societies. And I think that's right. I think that what's interesting is that every human culture, virtually every human culture with some small exceptions, has gone through this kind of tribal level of development, moving from a band-level society to a tribal-level society. The basic reason that happens is a matter of power. And power is something we've not talked a lot about in the presentations earlier today, but militarily, a tribally organized society can beat a band-level society because it scales. You scale a tribal-level society by pushing the number of ancestors that you believe you're descended from to further and further generations back, and you can get very, very large groupings that think that they are related. It may be fictive kinship, but they think that they're related. It's encapsulated in that Bedouin saying, me against my brother, me and my brother against my cousin, me and my cousins against the outsider, right? So you can scale a tribal society, you can organize violence in a much more effective way, and that's why tribal societies began to and it also depended on things like the invention of agriculture that provided more resources, but this is why band-level societies were eventually displaced by tribal ones, but they in turn were generally displaced about 6,000 years ago by state-level societies. State-level societies are very different because they have a centralized source of power that tries to exert a monopoly of power. This is the famous Max Weber definition of a state. It's a legitimate monopoly of force over territory. Tribal societies have no tax collector. They have no ability to coercively extract resources from their societies. They have no standing armies. They have no centralized judicial system. Justice in a tribal society is a kind of negotiation between rival segments where if you kill somebody, you pay a penalty as a result of a negotiation between your kin group and the other kin group that was wrong. In the Germanic tribes that settled Europe, this was known as the Wehrgeld. But there's no justice system as such. States add all of that. They add a hierarchical monopoly of power that is able to enforce the state's will. It makes them much less egalitarian. Tribal societies are actually quite democratic in a certain sense. If you don't want to listen to the big man that's running your particular tribal segment, you take your kin and just wander off somewhere. There's no way to keep people, coercively employed in a single organization. States bring that with them. The kind of justification, the ideological justification is different because tribal societies really depend on a religious belief in the power of dead ancestors and unborn children to affect outcomes in the present. So if you, for example, have gone to Mexico at the time, late October, the Day of the Dead, you'll see Mexican families going to the grave of their ancestors with a six-pack of Tecate and some tortillas, leaving them in the cemetery because it comes from a pre-Columbian belief that, by the way, was true in China, it was true in India, it was true in ancient Greece and Rome, that the actual spirits of the ancestors are living in the ground where they're buried, and they get hungry. And if they don't get fed, they're going to be very angry, they're going to come back as ghosts, and they're going to haunt you in the present. State-level societies have to have a different ideological system in order to unite people at a much larger scale. State-level societies can have millions of people organized into a single social unit. Ancestor worship is not a sufficient ideology to encompass that, and that's why the growth of state-level societies was oftentimes associated with the growth of the so-called axial religions. If you think about a religion like Islam, it is an ideology that was designed to get the Arabs out of tribalism. Arab society was one of the most intensely tribally organized of any in the world. They could not cooperate, and therefore they were a very minor political player in the outskirts of the Byzantine and the Roman and Frankish empires, until the Prophet Muhammad comes and says, no, you're all part of a universal ummah. It's actually a kind of anti-tribal ideology that says that in God's eyes, everybody is equal. As a Muslim, it doesn't matter what tribal segment you come from, you are one of God's creatures. And it allowed the Arabs to then conquer, basically, most of the Mediterranean basin and the Middle East because they could field large armies based on a much higher level, much more complex form of ideology. All right, so that's tribalism. We have some surviving tribes that are determined by geography and climatic conditions, but basically we all live in state-level societies. Now, in this discussion, we need to distinguish what is, in a sense, natural or part of our genetic heritage and what is socially constructed. And I think it's very important to keep those straight. There are evolutionary sources of contemporary behavior that I think the social psychologists have already identified. I would put them in a slightly different way. I think that they're clearly psychological, genetically based psychological mechanisms that provide for social cooperation. One of them is the principle of inclusive fitness that the biologist William Hamilton described. We are altruistic towards other people in proportion to the number of genes that we share, which explains our preference for close relatives. There's a principle of reciprocal altruism. Human beings on a face-to-face basis like to exchange gifts or favors, so we favor friends, but in a direct sort of way. Robert Trivers, the biologist, described this occurring not just among human societies, but even among different species of animals. I would say that Richard Wrangham noted, the difference between higher primates and human beings is really language. Language allows human beings to develop a capacity for norm generation. You can describe a norm in abstract terms because you have language, and it's also created a psychology of norm following. And so human beings are intensely conformist. The norms, take very complex forms. Every religion is an ideology. It's a set of ideas that establishes standards for normative behavior. and people invest a great deal psychologically in being loyal to those norms. I'm afraid, as some of our earlier speakers have indicated, violence, I don't think it comes from the outside of the human condition. It's deeply bred into human beings, especially into human males. Politics, political institutions, I mean, that's what I study, is the origin and evolution of political institutions. The reason we have political institutions is to control violence. That tendency towards violence would spin out of control if we did not have rules, if we didn't have institutions that constrain the behavior of people. Then finally, I would say there is an aspect of the human psyche that Plato described with the Greek word thumos. Thumos means something like pride or spiritedness when translated into English. And it really has to do with identity, a sense of identity, that human beings believe that they have an inner self, and they want that inner self to be respected. They want other human beings to acknowledge the dignity of that inner self, and if they do not get that recognition, they get very angry. It's tied directly to some very, very powerful human emotions of pride, guilt, shame, and anger. And all of these are social emotions that explain, I think, the kind of biological substrate on which human sociability is built. Now, that's you might say, the natural or evolutionary or biological part, but the definition of what constitutes an in-group is completely socially constructed. Nationalists and racists and a lot of other people that define in-groups in that fashion often assert that they are simply reverting to a natural, somehow, genetically determined category, and that is complete nonsense because all of those categories are socially constructed. I mean, for example, Bosnian Muslims and Serbian Christians, Orthodox Serbs, genetically there's no difference between them whatsoever. Just so happens the Bosnians were converted to Islam under Ottoman rule and they have a different religion. And yet the Serbs committed genocide against the Bosnian Muslims based on that difference. It was not rooted in biology whatsoever. Hutus and Tutsis, I mean, many of the horrible conflicts that we've seen, genocidal conflicts, are really not based on anything particularly biological. And so, if we want to understand something like the rise of populism, you can say, well, there are these general human characteristics that explain the basis of sociability, but it does not explain the particular forms that the in-groups take in different historical periods. That is completely dependent on contingent historical facts, economic forces, climate, geography, a whole bunch of things that have nothing to do with nature or human nature or anything of the sort. All right, so now I'm going to get into the second part, which is the explanation of why we're now seeing the rise of populism today. But to explain that, I actually have to go back a little bit historically because this is not a new phenomenon. The way that human beings have been defining in-groups and out-groups has been changing repeatedly and going in certain cycles over the centuries. I'm only going to go back about 5 centuries or so, but just to illustrate the point that, again, these definitions are very variable. So if you think about Europe in the year 1500, it's divided among, maybe 1,000 different little principalities and princely states and so forth. There's a few larger dynasties and would-be empires, but it is united by a single universal Catholic Church. The Reformation happens early in the 16th century. Europe then organizes itself. It begins to define in-group and out-group in religious terms between Protestants and Catholics, between different wings of Protestantism, and so forth. And then Europe falls into 150 years of unremitting religious warfare that kills, something like 40% of the population of what's now the territory of Germany in the 30 Years' War. In 1648, you have the Peace of Westphalia, in which basically European princes say, okay, We're not going to fight over religion anymore. Every prince can determine the religious confession of his territory, and that is something that is not going to be the object of political struggle. And a new doctrine called liberalism is developed by people like Thomas Hobbes or John Locke, where they basically say governments should not be about religion. They should not be defined by religious identity. We're going to push that into private life because we want to preserve the right to life. The right to life in the American Declaration of Independence actually comes from Thomas Hobbes in the experience of the English Civil War, in which lots of people were killed over religious passion. And he said that should be exiled from politics. We need, if you wanted to use a modern word, he'd say we need a more inclusive ideology that will allow Protestants and Catholics to live peacefully together, and we'll do that by making religion basically a matter of private confession. And so liberalism grows up in the Netherlands, in England, and again, the in-group is defined in terms of universal rights, the rights of man, and so forth, right? That's the first phase. Now, in the 19th century, you begin to have a shift out of that towards what I think is really the first form of modern identity politics, which is 19th century European nationalism. There are very specific reasons for this. Some of them are technological, like the invention of the printing press and other technologies that allow people to communicate over much larger social spaces, geographical spaces. But another of them was industrialization, because beginning in the 19th century, Europe, as it began to modernize economically, people left their little villages where they understood who they were. They were peasants that were living under a priest with their families. They had fixed confessions. They had fixed jobs. All of a sudden, they're working in a big city. They're living in a dormitory with people that are very different from them. They may speak other languages. They may have other religious outlooks. It's a very confusing and alienating world. Emile Durkheim, the sociologist, invented the word anomie to describe the sense of normlessness that accompanied that shift from village life to modern urban life. And that was really the source of nationalism, because what the nationalists could do is take a confused peasant that said, who the hell am I after all? Because I thought I was Hans living in this little village in Saxony, and all of a sudden I'm working in this big factory with a labor union and bosses and communist parties and all of this. And the nationalists said, I'll tell you who you are. You are a proud German. You're part of a linguistic group. And it also served an economic function, because a modern market economy requires a common language, a common culture by which workers and managers can communicate with one another and organize economic production on a much larger scale. And so in the 19th century, you have the rise of the kinds of national identities that came to, it's a modern phenomenon, this idea that your political unit should, the territory of your political unit should correspond to a cultural unit defined primarily by language. That is not the way Europe or most of the world was organized prior to the 19th century. But for the reasons, coming out of this need to have a common sustaining culture in an economically modernizing society with ever-expanding markets, European nationalism was born. This has the effect of creating 2 world wars, killing off a lot of the population of the countries that were contesting these national identities. And in 1945, the world, just like in 1648, says, okay, we're tired of this. We want to create a more liberal world order based on greater cooperation, free trade, liberal institutions, liberal international institutions that will foster both democracy within countries, liberal democracies that will be tolerant within their own societies, as well as an international global order that will allow trade and communications and migration and so forth. And that was the kind of liberal world order that we have been living in really for the last 70 years. And now I think, if you want to talk about the rise of populism, I think that is being fed by the strains that are being created by that liberal world order, because it has tended to, so the conventional wisdom about why you're getting, okay, so what is populism? So populism are publicly or popularly elected officials who use their democratic legitimacy for having been elected to basically undermine the liberal institutions of their liberal democracies, because they say the people elected me to carry out the people's wishes. I personally am the embodiment of that popular will, and if there's a judge or a bureaucracy or a media that is standing in my way, I am going to do what I can to undermine that. And this is what has been happening now in any number of countries around the world, shifting from a liberal form of organization to one based on a much narrower form of identity. So Viktor Orban in Hungary, re-elected as prime minister in 2011, begins to weaken the Hungarian court system. He puts the Hungarian mainstream media under the control of his crony friends, and he says Hungarian national identity is based on Hungarian ethnicity. And of course, not everybody in Hungary is an ethnic Hungarian. Moreover, there's lots of ethnic Hungarians in many of the surrounding countries, and so that is not a formula either for internal toleration or for international peace in the long run. So that's gone on there. It's gone on in Poland. It's happened now with, well, actually Salvini is out of power, but populist government was elected in Italy, Bolsonaro in Brazil, and I think most shockingly in the United States with the election of Donald Trump, and in Britain with the vote for Brexit, both of which were powered by populist movements that had exactly the same structure. So Donald Trump comes into office saying, mainstream media is the enemy of the American people. He attacks his own intelligence community. He attacks his own Justice Department and FBI because it gets in the way of his own personal interests. And so, like populists in other parts of the world, he is anti-institutional, and he's also trying to redefine American national identity, I think, returning it to a kind of ethnic definition. Now, there are other movements, identity-based movements, similar to that don't necessarily use nation as the mobilizing principle. So, for example, in India, Prime Minister Modi is the head of the BJP, a Hindu nationalist party. Modern India was created as a liberal state, a secular state, and he wants to change that identity to one based on Hinduism, which again is very problematic because it excludes the 150, 200 million Muslims living in that country. In Sri Lanka and Myanmar, you have a militant Buddhist movement that is highly intolerant of people like the Rohingya in the Rakhine state, have driven them out, basically committed a genocide against them because, again, they are reverting to a very specific and narrower religious identity that does not have room for some of the other religious confessions there. And so this is a shift that has been taking place in many countries around the world, including some of the oldest and most consolidated democracies, namely Britain and the United States. And I think that it is very much, so as I said, the conventional wisdom explaining why this sort of thing is happening tends to be economic. It's a reaction to globalization. I'm sure that you've heard versions of this argument. Globalization made everybody richer, but it concentrated wealth in the hands of a kind of narrow oligarchic class in country after country. Ordinary people, and particularly working class people in rich countries, found their jobs being outsourced to low-wage workers in China, India, Vietnam, and so forth. And so that, I think, is part of the explanation, and it does explain why this is happening, in 2016 and not 10 years prior or 15 years prior or something like that. But the identity part, I think, is underestimated as a driver of that because economic status is actually seen as a marker of social status. If I have a job, it means that my society respects me enough to pay me for what I do, and if I lose my job, it means I've lost that degree of respect. it also is very much based on a narrowing of one's sense of what the community is that one is trying to protect. And so if you listen to the rhetoric of the right-wing populists, it is really that they, meaning these foreigners and these elites that are supporting them, are trying to steal our country. They're trying to take our country away from us. And by our country, what that oftentimes means is a country that is defined in ethnic terms. And, you know, the consequences of this, I think, for the survival of, you know, liberal democracy are pretty clear. So I'm going to end, again, because it's late. The one thing I want to leave you with, though, is the following, that, as I said, these tendencies towards in-groups and out-groups may be based on evolved human characteristics that are very deeply bred into our psyches. But the definitions of what constitutes the in-group and out-group are completely socially constructed. And as you can see, over the generations and centuries, they've changed from broader ones to narrower ones. The narrower ones usually end up in conflict. They end up in conflict, and for that reason, we design political institutions to deliberately broaden the sense of what the nation is, for example, to make it more inclusive, to make it more tolerant. That was the origin of liberalism in the 17th century, and it is the basis of the liberalism that appeared after 1945. And because these things are socially constructed, I think in a way that's what gives you hope, because we're not somehow reverting to an atavistic biology that is inevitably going to make us racist and xenophobic and whatnot. If you have the right kinds of institutions and if you have the right kind of political leadership, you can redefine those identities and you can make them broader and more inclusive rather than narrow and xenophobic. And I think that's what we've got to do politically, not just in the United States, but in many countries around the world. So thank you very much.
Well, I used to think I was fairly well informed and articulate until hearing these 7 amazing speakers. Lest any of this be too demoralizing, I just want to very briefly recount something that happened to me. I met an older gentleman in his 70s in a wheelchair. He was missing half his right leg. Clearly, it had just happened. His leg was swaddled in bandages. And I was talking to him, and I said, "Oh, you seem really brave about this new circumstance that you're in." And he looked at me like I was the biggest fool that he'd seen all week, and he said, "Brave about it? There's young people in this country missing both their legs. Don't tell me I'm brave." Now, there's a person who was looking beyond his own tragedy and considering the rest of the people in this country as his kin. He was looking at 350 million people as a kind of tribe. I think if that gentleman is capable of that way of thinking, collectively as a nation and as the human race, we all can. I don't know what his name was. We talked for about 5 minutes, and he forever changed the way I think about people. And he has given me enormous hope in the last few years. So we are going to bring our speakers out. Please come on out, and we are going to take some minutes of questions from your cards. Come on out. Don't be shy. We'll have about 15 minutes of questions. Okay, for Polly Wiessner, what, if any, forms of new peacemaking have emerged in response to cultural changes in the areas that you study?
So The people, with all this trouble with the introduction of high-powered weapons and increased warfare, the population and the traditional leaders and magistrates in the customary courts are not accepting this. And so finally, for the first time, people are turning against tribal loyalties, and they are turning in to the formal law system and to jail the young men who are causing this trouble. So this is a very big change. They've also decided not to pay compensation for warfare and peacemaking for people killed, which makes it much more expensive. So there are positive movements coming up from the grassroots and from the tribal leaders, very little from the government.
Allison Brooks, what are the prospects for a tribe forming that encompasses all humans?
Oh, that's an easy one.
I think that, should I stand up?
Oh, either way, whatever.
Okay. I think that there are issues of scale that are very hard to deal with. So I think that what seems to work best is to have a sort of nested leadership arrangement where you have small communities that are well run, and then you have that a larger coalescent over authority that regulates the small community. I think it's very hard to imagine a tribe that everybody belongs to. There are just too many differences, too many beliefs, too many ideas about the past, about ancestors, about creations, about all kinds of different views that are always going to divide people to some extent. I don't see those going away. We're just as, in fact, watching the spread of fundamentalist religions in Africa in the last 50 years that I've been working there, I think it's very hard to imagine that all of these different viewpoints can be encompassed in one tribe. But we could all feel that we were productive members of nations. I think that's perhaps the best we can do.
Sebastian, I just wanted to compliment that. One's got to agree that it's difficult to imagine how that would happen. But one way to play with the idea is to think about the evolution of the number of languages, because the number of languages has been declining steadily over historical time. And you can project in the future when there'll be a single word language, which might move us in the direction that the question was asking about. And the answer, I think, is somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 years AD.
So the next question was for you, and it's related to that. Does the strengthening of the sense of us necessarily lead to the strengthening of the sense of exclusion of them?
I think the short answer is no. And we heard cases from Polly in particular about how you can build up tremendous group loyalties and not necessarily light the fire of intergroup hostility. So that's great. But on the other hand, I think there are constant temptations in that direction that we constantly need to be fighting against.
Bazarin, how do you show bias towards a liked other? I'm not sure what that means. Maybe you will know.
So that's favoritism, right? I mean,
Yes,
that is what.
yes.
Yeah. So a bias towards a like. So I would say maybe this was maybe you're getting at something I said during the talk where I mentioned that I had an experience, but my experience was just how subtle the similarity of the other might be, and my story was that I was called on the phone by a woman who was a journalist asking me to be interviewed for the article she was writing, and I asked her who she was writing for, and she said the name of the magazine, and I don't don't particularly like this magazine and how it portrays psychology, so I said, I'm finally going to have to tell you guys I'm not going to do this interview. You don't represent this field very well, and I said a lot more. But anyway, she was very nice, and she said, well, I'll tell my editor. And as she was hanging up, she said, oh, Professor Banerjee, I should tell you, I used to be a student at Yale when you were a professor there. What am I supposed to do now? I mean, I should have said, Annie, I'm so glad you and I shared a zip code in Connecticut for 4 years. Bye-bye. But no, out of my mouth, without my permission, came the words, okay, come over, I'll talk to you. And I did the interview, and I've thought about that a lot because that's the bias in favor. And I think that an idea whose time may not have come is for us to think that people like us, we live in such privileged circumstances that we don't have to harm members of outgroups every day. We discriminate by helping members of our own tribe, and that's how we discriminate. Okay? And so now even the act of helping has to be rethought. Not that you shouldn't help, but who are you helping is a very important question to ask now. Yeah.
I'm out of question cards here, but I actually have one question of my own that came to my mind during the conversation. Oh, here's more cards. Oh, there goes my question. Well, maybe I'll proceed with it anyway. Can I ask a question? You guys go. Okay, so I read a book by a researcher named Avi Tushman about the genetic origins of political belief, of conservatism and liberalism. And what he found through, and other researchers, he sort of collected all of this data. What he found through twin studies, identical twins who were raised separately are far more likely to share political opinion, to be conservative or liberal, than fraternal twins who were raised together in the same environment. And he found that around half of the variance in political opinion can be traced to genetic roots, genetic origin. So my question to any of you all is does that, to me, rather heartening and pretty surprising statistic, does that inform any of the conversation that we've had tonight? Would anyone like to address that?
Frank? Yeah. No?
Yeah.
Me?
Well, you were just pointing out that the biology doesn't matter anyway.
So, yeah, I've seen that kind of data. Jonathan Haidt also adduces certain things about, things that go on in the cognitive process of conservatives versus liberals, and that may have some kind of a genetic origin. However, it's only 50% of the variance,
Right.
and if that's true, it inclines things in a certain direction, but it's not that helpful for policy purposes.
Right.
If what you want to do is actually overcome those kinds of biases, you got to work on the 50% of the variance that is not due to, genetics.
Yeah.
So just, I think an important, somewhat technical point about this is that it's important to understand that the percentage of variance that's accounted for in a population by genes or anything else doesn't mean that it's fixed for all time. So it could be that at some future point in time, your genes tell you very little about your politics, right? So for example, you can have a bunch of plants, let's say, in a very low water environment. And in that environment, plants that have certain mutation will be much more likely to grow than the others. But if you have an environment that has plenty of water and plenty of sunshine, then the genetic differences between the plants might not tell you anything about which plant is likely to be taller or shorter. So people sometimes hear those statistics or findings about how much of the variability is accounted for by genes. And it can be interesting and important, but people naturally read that as it's genes and therefore it's fixed forever. But that's not true. It's how much of the variability that we see within a group at this time in this place is accounted for by genetic differences. And that can change over time, and that's important as well.
Thank you.
I would add just how I'd be very interested to know how many people in this audience have a rule that you can't talk about politics at Thanksgiving dinner because of the diversity in your own genetically related family, which was certainly true of mine.
That's a great point.
So, and of many political scientists in faculty that I know who are liberal and whose families are deeply conservative. I think that there's a certain issue with these statistics that
Right.
are
And
that
it's
are
also the
problematic.
case that whatever that genetic predisposition might be, it's not that it directly affects political beliefs. I think that it's manifested through what my colleague Jerry Kagan would call early temperament. So babies vary greatly in their temperament. There are those who run away from their parents and explore the world, and others who stay very close and who are scared. I wouldn't be surprised at all if that kind of exploratory behavior that is not of your own making, it's partly and quite deeply genetic, could lead you to just go off into this new tribe where you go play with a new tribe and those experiences, and you often see those differences in children. So something as simple as a personality orientation that has been called openness to new experience, for example. And it's a marker of humans, and we vary on that dimension, and that could easily translate into something that becomes a political difference as an adult, where you shy away from difference or move towards it.
For Molly, if the internet and social media fuels outrage and conflict, it's hard to read here, more than other media, how did American society polarize to the point of total civil war in the 1840s to 1860s? My point being, is technology really the key factor in polarization? It's a good question.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think the dynamics that we're seeing in the modern context of social media are in some ways new, but in some ways obviously not new. And it's really difficult to tease apart the differences. I think one question that's on a lot of our minds is, how do specific design features of social media that are choices that were made potentially for very different goals by people at tech companies, how are those design choices affecting our behavior? And is there a way that we can keep what we like about social media and tweak some other things so that the social consequences are potentially more positive?
Thank you. Are you guys prepared for maybe a little bit of philosophy? Okay. Considering terms we use to identify ourselves, whether Italian American, African American, hashtag #MeToo or hashtag Black Lives Matter, how do we speak up for who we are and protect our identities without fracturing our humanity?
It's an excellent question.
Yes.
Well, I would say that your identity, which makes you willing to sacrifice for a group, is your humanity also.
So this is actually an issue that I wrote about in my last book called Identity. I think that one of the problems is that both on the left and the right, the identities that we choose have been getting narrower and narrower. And that has consequences for the overall, social cohesion of the society. And in the modern world, I don't see really any alternative to actually returning to a more integrative identity. And I think it has to be at the nation-state level, because I really don't think that there are political structures that have meaningful control over power at a transnational level yet. That was the aspiration of the European Union, but we're not there yet. And therefore, what you need is an integrative identity based on, some sense of national identity, but it has to be inclusive. It has to be democratic. It has to be non-ethnic, non-racial, not based on religion, but based on a common set of democratic ideas. And that's, something I think that's been missing in a lot of our political rhetoric is, how do you generate narratives that produce that kind of more integrative sense of, who we are.
I might take a quick whack at that one as well. It's a really important question. The most extreme environment I've ever been in, socially, was combat with U.S. military, with airborne infantry in a small outpost in eastern Afghanistan. And there was an awful lot of combat. There were a lot of casualties. There was a lot of heroism. Everyone out there was almost killed, at least once, myself included. It was mixed in every conceivable way. I mean, one of the amazing things about the U.S. military, for its many flaws, is that it really is an incredible melting pot. Every religion, every race, every kind of politics, every region of the country, and none of those things were given any thought whatsoever. And the worse the situation was, the less those identities mattered at all. Where racism, for example, was a bit of a problem was in the larger bases that weren't under physical threat. They were not getting attacked. But out at a 20-man position, it was all men, 20-man position, kind of environment we were in, those guys were completely blind to any relative value between who was Italian-American and who was black and whatever. There was only one black guy in the platoon. And so, what I would say, one guy said to me, he said, it's amazing, there's guys out here who straight up hate each other, but we would all die for each other. And there does seem to be something about an extremely challenging, hostile environment that makes people a little bit more blind to the differences between them. And one can argue that maybe this nation right now is suffering from a lack of existential threat. That if we were really under some kind of existential threat, that those divisions that are so poisonous right now to us might actually subside a little bit. Okay, let me see. All right, why do humans prize okay, we're in the philosophy, sorry, but there's only 4 minutes left, so we can make it. Why do humans pride themselves of free will, agency, and autonomy if most of history and modernity is full of violence or preparations for violence, even after 2 world wars? So how do we reconcile free will with what seems to be a genetic propensity for violence?
I don't know if I'm qualified. It's funny, it's an interesting question because often the question goes the other way. That is the thought that how can people truly have free will if they don't have the possibility of making either good or bad choices? If everything is just determined from the beginning, either you're determined to be good or you're determined to be bad, where would your free will go? But I take the larger question there is, how can we have this kind of view of ourselves as, in some sense, sailing our own ship and with the possibility of sailing it in the right direction when you look at human history and see all of these horrors? And I think one answer is that human history is horrible in the sense that you can count up the horrors and they're horrible and there are lots of them. But as our colleague Steven Pinker has argued in his book, Better Angels of Our Nature, much to a lot of people's surprise, if you look at the most basic indices of how much violence is there, how much education is there, how much political self-determination is there, things have been generally getting better and better over historical time. In recent years, there have been some breaks, but in the past, there have been some breaks with that. So I actually think a quantitative view of human history is consistent with our being not the worst species that you can imagine and having some self-respect. But that doesn't mean that our big problems aren't very big problems, and we may do ourselves in the end with climate change or with nukes. So it's not like everything's okay. But I don't think that our view of ourselves as individuals or as a species should leave us to give up hope completely, not by any means.
I do also think that this emphasis on individual moral autonomy is a very Western idea. I mean, I can give you an account of how it emerged in the West. I think it kind of has Christian roots, but other cultures do not prize individual autonomy nearly the extent that ours does.
Okay. For Professor Wrangham, have you studied the capacity of Homo sapiens to execute an imagined enemy aggressor rather than one that is actually has actually exhibited overly aggressive behavior? Not sure.
This sounds a little bit like video games.
Yeah, I'm not, how do you execute an imagined enemy? I'm not sure how you, yeah.
Well, the short answer is no. I have not.
But we have 52 seconds left, so you have to continue on.
Use it as you will.
That's right. You can talk about
But it raises the question of whether or not video games intensify our feelings of hostility towards other groups. And as I understand the data, actually, surprisingly maybe, they have very, very little effect. I don't know if anyone has any more expertise on this area. But,
All right. So, thank you for coming to hear these wonderful, wonderful people share their knowledge. Please give them a huge hand of gratitude. And I'll proceed with the ritual reading of the sponsors and the thank yous. The Leakey Foundation would like to thank our sponsors, Abigail and Bowman Cutter, Chet Kamen and Nancy Schaefer, Ann and Jeff McGee and Calda. Sorry, I hope I got that all right. William and Lisa Worthland, Abigail Bernhardt, Duggan and Aaron Jensen, George and Ann Lace, Diana McSherry and Patrick Poe, Gene Newman, Camilla and George Smith, and with sincere appreciation to Ann and Gordon Getty and the Leakey Foundation's donors and staff, and with special thanks to organizers Chet Kamen and Richard Wrangham. Thank you so much, everybody. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.